Hello, romance lovers. Today I have a story for you called I Took the Mask Off the Tyrant. Don't forget to support this video with a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new interesting stories. However, when the guillotine warned the heroine in a mysterious voice that it would kill her, the dream suddenly ended and the protagonist found herself in a completely different place, as if in a dungeon, where there are cells and iron bars. In addition, in front of the heroine with meek pink hair, there were two priests who approached her and began to say that a better life awaited him after death. But the lady, who was mistaken for a boy, said that she was not Jodel, and they were mistaken. With her hands tied, Jodel looked at the priests with horror as they told her that she did not have long to live before her execution, so they asked if she wanted to eat something for the last time. Remembering her past life, the girl realized that in it she liked to read many novels before going to bed. But when she imagined a certain angel with wings and in a snow-white robe, she realized that there was no romance in the last work she read. But when the lady realized that she did not want to move into the novel of the book, which also has an unusual, merciful protagonist, the owner of the sacred state of Palladium, she looked at the puddle and the drops that fell from the sky. She looked at herself with the help of a small puddle and realized that she now had pink eyes and hair that was so short that she could be mistaken for a boy. And then the lady realized that she had been reborn as a villain in the novel. The girl also presented herself on her knees before the long-haired king, realizing that it was his past Jodel who had been pursuing him all her life. Loved him, but the king had never reciprocated her feelings. Now the pink-haired heroine found herself all alone in a death cell, realizing that in a few moments her life would end completely, which is why she looked at the floor sadly and devastatedly, with her hands tied. However, in the reflection of the water, she clearly noticed not only herself, but the past Jodel, who had lived for a long time in the guise of a guy only in order to keep an eye on the king, with whom she was madly in love. Imagining her phone, which the girl used to read the novel in her past life, she realized that if this was really the novel she had read, maybe at least the main character would believe that she was not actually Jodel. She had already come up with a little plan in her head, which is why she suddenly knocked on the iron bars, causing the guard with a knife and a high cap to be very surprised by the unexpected noise. The warrior turned to Jodel and said that it was forbidden to make noise in this room, but the pink-haired heroine interrupted him, exclaiming that she was very hungry, causing the guard to ask in confusion what she wanted. The girl, who could easily be mistaken for a boy, firmly told the guard that she would be punished and would accept it if they allowed her to dine on something tasty for the last time. But when the guard came to Jodel again with a tray of delicious food, he began to call the defendant. But even when he entered her cell, the protagonist was nowhere to be seen. And what happened next scared him beyond belief, because in the middle of the silence and darkness, he was suddenly attacked by Jodel, who scared the warrior to death before dealing with him. All the food in the tray itself, which the guard was holding in his hands, fell to the floor with a crash, because the heroine did not need any food, and she was only doing freedom, using the Last Supper to escape. Meanwhile, Jodel herself did not hesitate at all, because she was already running towards the bright white light, hoping that she would be able to escape from the dungeon, meet the main character of the story, and tell him about what had happened. She heard how the guards had already made noise and began actively searching for the intruder, checking all the corridors, while the girl continued to run forward towards the light, because she had no idea how the prison was arranged. However, she was very surprised that, having run straight into the light, the girl found herself in an unknown library, where there was a dim light illuminating the tall bookcases, which Jodel was looking at. The girl wanted to start running as quickly as possible, at least in some direction. But because she tripped over her own foot, she hit the shelves with books and was already preparing to fall to the floor from her clumsiness. And when she was already on the floor, looking with horror at the suddenly darkened interior, the girl realized that the shelf with books seemed to have moved a little, and it seemed to have happened because of her, because she felt incredible fear for herself. However, as soon as Jodel turned her head in the opposite direction, she noticed in the distance a tall, long-haired blonde man with a sword, behind whom pale, lifeless people were visible, but he was looking only at her. Seeing with her own eyes a large mountain of bodies, the girl covered her mouth with her hands, and with horror in her soul realized that she was seeing in front of her a man with a bloody knife, who had clearly noticed her and called her a rat who was only trying to hide from him. The man with snow-white hair was already heading towards her and threatening her, asking who she was and if she had seen what was behind him. The long-haired guy touched the girl's chin with his hands and asked what exactly she didn't see if she said that she was saying this. But this only scared Jodel even more, who looked into his eyes and wanted to live. He knelt down in front of her, which prevented the lady from running anywhere, also asking her how she got there. But Jodel only whimpered in fear and at first could not utter even one word. And when the stranger in front of her asked Jodel with a smile whether she had lost her power of speech, the short-haired madam herself shook and looked at him, not understanding who was in front of her and what he wanted. The girl realized that in front of her was the very main character of the novel, a king named Ulysses. But she clearly remembered that there was no such scene as was happening now in the novel, just as there was absolutely no blood. And now he was getting closer and closer to her face, while the pink-haired heroine did not believe what was happening. And the blonde himself was asking her what had happened to her and what was wrong, while a sly smile was visible on his face. Unable to bear it, Jodel hit the gentleman's hand with which he was touching her face, turned his head to the side, intending to find a way out with his eyes, realizing that this psycho and tyrant could not be the same merciful heroine from the novel. She began to nervously knock on the cabinet and shout for someone to open it, as if there really was someone on the other side who would help her, although it was useless, because she was left alone with the tyrant, in whose hands was a bloody sword. But the girl's behavior only surprised the white-haired gentleman as he stood up and straightened his back, looking at Jodel with a smile and asking her if he could ask her one question, still addressing her as a guy. When Jodel asked how he knew her name, the gentleman replied that everyone knew her now, because she should have been hanged on the gallows by now. But now he wanted to clarify with her whether she tried to escape, which is why the lady stopped knocking on the closet. But the lady with short hair was even more surprised when fleeting memories of being sentenced to death before this, which the priest had done in the temple, came into her head, and she meanwhile continued to say that she was in love with the king. The memories of the past Jodel allowed the current Hern Percanon to remember how she fell on her knees before the king, telling him to have mercy on her, because he is always very kind to everyone and merciful. The girl also clearly remembered the surprised face of the king, who looked at her with his mouth slightly open, while the past Jodel hysterically asked him why everyone only hated her and didn't love her like him. The main character grabbed her head, realizing that she was reborn as the same stalker who constantly stole the king's things, took his clothes out of adoration, which is why the heroine realized that the past Jodel was a real pervert. But the king did not allow the heroine to escape, because he blocked her every escape route with his hand, smilingly saying that he still had the ankle that she had surrendered days earlier in a fit of emotion and a plea for mercy. And when the protagonist hoped that at least the good main character in the novel would be able to pardon her, Ulysses only smiled, saying that begging for mercy was useless and not a very good idea. Jodel thought only that she did not want to die even when the master swung his sword at her and told her not to worry, because he would kill her in one blow, painlessly and lightning fast. As soon as the heroine remembered a certain weakness of Ulysses that she could exploit, she immediately kissed him on the lips, while pulling his cheeks towards her with her hands, which greatly surprised the king. And while the main character was doing everything to stay alive, in a completely different temple, which has a blue, semicircular roof and a snow-white design, something interesting and unexpected was also happening. Noticing that some parts of the temple began to fall from the ceiling to the floor and break, the priests came to the place and were afraid, saying that the gates were destroyed and danger awaited them. But when they realized that everything was fine with them, they realized that it was all about the internal activity of the Holy King, which came into contact with an equally strong aura. And when the priests in the temple were sure that the Holy King had finally found his chosen one, Ulysses meanwhile looked at the lady with anger and asked her if she was crazy, which made Jodel shake, saying that it was so. The gentleman began to continuously question Jodel about what she knew and what she had seen, also extending his hand to her, which made the pink-haired lady close her eyes in fear and protect herself with her hands, shouting that she was very sorry for everything she had done. But as soon as she felt something unusual on her forehead, on which an unusual sign with 3 dots had already appeared, the lady looked at the gentleman in surprise, as if asking him what had happened after the kiss. And the guy himself was incredibly surprised, because a sign appeared on his forehead exactly the same way, which he felt perfectly, having lost the gift of speech, clearly from the new power that had appeared, which was previously unknown even to him. Remembering the extraordinary temple under the crimson sunset, the girl realized that if the same sign appeared on the gentleman's forehead, it meant that he was in truth not only the master of the Palladium state, but also the last descendant of the sacred family. Imagining in her head the girl and the boy like gods in heaven, the lady realized that being a purebred heir of the family, Ulysses was obliged to leave his blood and give birth to a child. The Holy Lord, having a beautiful appearance with long hair, always remained very withdrawn to other people, which made everyone think that it was because of his holiness. But the reason was completely different. Remembering the kiss, the pink-haired girl realized that it was precisely because of physical contact with others that those bonds appeared that could not be broken, which is why they had strange marks on their foreheads. This is not just a contact, but a connection that will no longer tear two holy people apart, because the gentleman who has extraordinary abilities as well as an unusual appearance should not resist them. The same thing applies to the main character, which is why she imagined herself to be exactly the same as the snot. Because from now on, just because of one kiss, those threads of affection appeared between them, thanks to which they will no longer be separated. Remembering that due to such attachment, greater energy can be transferred to a weaker one. The girl imagined hands that slowly transfer the treasured, glowing piece of magic to other palms. The girl realized that in the novel, Ulysses did not deal with anyone because he did not want anyone to know his weakness. But now the protagonist stands in front of him, pressed against the bookshelves, maintaining silence due to awkwardness. But suddenly, when the lady was thinking about the fact that before this, no one except Ulysses himself knew that contacts appear only thanks to a kiss, the gentleman put the blade of his sword to the hero, causing several cut strands to slowly fall to the floor. Having threatened the girl with the sword, the gentleman said with a smile that he would immediately break the contact that had just been created, also telling the heroine with a smile on his face that she had tried in vain to save herself by addressing her as a boy. Although the pink-haired lady was shaking with fear, she still fought for her life, shouting at the master that he was wrong because he had no right to kill her with a sword or any other weapon. The Holy King understood the heroine's words when he reached his hand to his neck and realized that he felt pain there, which was caused precisely by the fact that he had applied a sharp sword to Jodel's neck, making a thin scratch on it. And when small drops of blood appeared on the blade in the girl's neck, she told the master with tears in her eyes that now, because of the connection, he could not kill her, because in that case, he himself would die. They both imagined themselves in their heads, hugging each other sweetly and blushing with romance, realizing that now, because of the connection, everyone could consider them a couple, like a sacred king falling in love with a student. As soon as the gentleman imagined this, he grabbed his face and said shamefacedly that everything wasn't so bad, because if you think about it, he had already lived enough of his life, so nothing more terrible could happen. And suddenly, Ulysses said that he would not refuse death even when he had finished with the heroine, from which he turned around and intended to go about his business with an unbridled anger, which was visible in his eyes. This frightened the main character even more. Tears flowed from her eyes like a river, and she waved her hands, asking the master to listen to him, because she knows the future and she has something to say. The next day, a guilty man appeared before the Holy King, who shouted to the Lord that he was not guilty of anything, because it was all a setup and evil intent, when the guards held him tightly and kept silent. And Ulysses himself sat on the throne and thought, while around him there were many other priests, looking at the master and not understanding what had happened to him after one very strange event. And when they asked the king if it didn't matter to him, because after that unusual event he seemed to have changed, Ulysses only smiled, telling everyone that everything was fine and he was glad that he could restore order even at a late hour. All the priests present blushed with embarrassment and began to smile in the same way, telling the gentleman that he was very generous and thought first of all about others, which they greatly appreciated. But in his head, Mr. Ulysses still remembered the main character, thinking that he was the guy who eventually told him the truth when the mark appeared on his face and which surprised him. For at the very moment when he was about to leave Jodel, he suddenly and fearfully cried out that the temple would soon fall into disrepair, at which the king instantly turned towards him and began to swing his sword again. And noticing that Jodel continued to cry, the gentleman listened to the lady's words that although she was a pervert who did not listen to anyone but herself, she unexpectedly saw the future and told him about it now. When Ulysses asked Jodel if he was talking nonsense, the pink-haired lady cried and said that she was telling the truth, and the temple's budget would really be impoverished. But in fact, she found out about it because she read a novel from her phone in her past life. The shocked, blue-eyed gentleman looked at Jodel with wide eyes, asking how she could have learned such astonishing information. After making the gentleman think of one person who was definitely connected to the temple budget, the girl said that he was not involved in the problems, so he should not be punished. The blue-eyed Gisoplin was even more surprised by this, which made him look at the lady with surprise when more and more questions arose in his head regarding how Jodel knew such information, and very clear information at that. Having imagined a red chest with coins in her head, Lay sniffled that money had long since started disappearing from the temple treasury, and around that time, Mr. Ulysses began to suspect something was wrong. But this was not the only problem in the state, because soon large, red-eyed monsters woke up in the world, from which the sacred king had to protect the inhabitants of the state, increasingly leaving his post. And because of this, the courage of the unknown criminal who carried out his malicious schemes in order to steal coins from the temple's blue jet became stronger and stronger, and his character more and more impudent. The pink-haired heroine also told the gentleman that the country of Palladium cannot grow agricultural crops, so it relies on importing products. But due to some point in the past, the quality of all products has dropped. Imagining the priest among the villagers who transport goods, the protagonist explained that the culprit of all this changes the supplier and in the process profits for himself so that they can line up. Recalling the map of the land of the state of Palladium, the girl in the guise of a guy said that the same man also bought land in the empire at a very low price. But that's not all. The outline of the temple popped into both of their minds when Jodel said that it was he, thanks to his reputation and influence, who spread the rumor that the main temple was going to build a medical facility on that land. And so, imagining a golden scale on one side of which was a bag of coins, the madam said that because the temple wanted to buy those lands, it would raise the price for them and sell them, earning several times more. The gentleman became very calm, looking at the pink-haired girl and asking her if all this was true, to which she replied that the criminal was taking advantage of the fact that the connection between the empire and the state was not active due to the distance. Gesturing with her hand, the girl with short hair said that because of the initially bad relations between the empire and the paladin, then the empire would raise this issue and attack the temple with claims, and the state would have to listen to her demands. Focused, the Holy King asked Jodel if this was the future he had seen by chance, as if the heroine's words were no longer so meaningless to him. Visualizing the red sky above the imperial temple, the girl also said that in her vision everything was exactly like this. And besides, the master found the culprit very late, which is why he ran away when the imperial family helped him. The Holy King of the Paladin state became more and more serious as he looked at the girl and asked her if it was really like that, thinking that the person in front of him was a boy. Imagining the culprit standing next to the imperial emblem with a smile on his face, the madam said that the reason he was able to escape was because he was supported by the imperial family when he himself sold the temple's name. Also, imagining a king and a pawn that defeats the first by splitting, Jodel said that even if the forces are dishonest, the empire will be able to deceive everyone and win, even if it is necessary to make a dishonest move. The couple continued to stand near the shelves with books. When the girl spoke, she even remembered the name of the criminal, whose name is Garam, and she said that all his documents about his parents were fake, because he grew up in an orphanage. Imagining how Garam prays to the temple, the girl said that although he obeys, he has enormous access to the accounting and budget, thanks to which he can steal money without hindrance. Now the gentleman looked at the man with pink hair, who put his hand on her cleavage and swore that he was telling the truth, and the Holy King could already believe her, because everything he told. So he never got around to punishing him, but simply turned around and walked away, saying he would deal with it later, when Jodel, behind him, looked surprised at what had happened. But before leaving, Ulysses turned to the heroine of the story, and in an ominous voice told her that he was giving him one day to simply think about his behavior, saying not to do anything stupid and to return to where she was originally. The main character was shaking with fear and looked at the departing Ulisses, who looked sternly ahead and said that now he would talk about this with the others. And for now, he ordered her not to stick her head out until the information from her was verified. The next morning, the protagonist was in bed even at dawn, but she was awakened by the voices of people she didn't know, which made her close her eyes unpleasantly, not understanding what was going on. She also noticed a long-haired man in her room, and only after waking up from sleep did she take him for a ghost. So she didn't even think about the fact that this aristocrat, who also has 2 guards, could be real. But suddenly the same sign came up to her and leaned as close as possible to her face, smiled, and ordered the girl to wake up immediately, which caused Jodel to instantly perk up and realize that the king was in front of her. And after a while, the couple was already at the table, on which there was tea with a teapot. But the sacred king did not touch it, keeping his hands folded when the pink-haired lady, who looked like a boy, on the contrary, thanked the gentleman for breakfast. She was visibly shaking with fear and anxiety, which Ulysses noticed as he was watching her closely, and the girl only looked up at him in embarrassment and asked why he had called her and whether she had made a mistake in who the temple's criminal was. But there was no anger or displeasure written on the king's face, On the contrary, he looked at the lady calmly, saying that she had been right about her loud statements, because Garum was hiding the country's stolen money. Hearing this, the girl with pink eyes instantly rejoiced, saying that this was real happiness and also rejoicing in her soul that now they would not be able to execute her so quickly because she was useful. However, the gentleman looked closely at Jodel and thought that this boy was definitely not the same as before, because before he was a real evil who was so nasty and smiling with anger that he was avoided, and he radiated only a dark aura. Thinking that Jodel was the strangest boy possible, even though he wasn't even a boy at all, Ulysses extended his hand to Jodel and told her to bring him his head. But the girl got scared, stood up on her chair, and asked the gentleman what he wanted. But when the girl asked Ulysses if he wanted to smash her head, he only smiled softly, saying that there was no point in hitting her empty stone head. He continued to smile sweetly, explaining to the boy in front of him that he just wanted to check what was true and what wasn't, from what she had said earlier. But Jodel asked the king if he could even recognize a lie. However, when the lord thought that the lady did not want to follow his instructions, he bared the blade of his sword, telling her with a smile to die right now in that case, and Jodel was horrified, not understanding how the lord got the sword and where it came from. After this, the girl allowed the holy king to touch her head, which caused everything around her to become darker, and she herself began to glow with magic, and Jodel herself wondered how far Ulysses could look into her memory. And the gentleman realized that Jodel was clearly hiding something from him, because in the emptiness of memory he saw tall buildings with identical windows that were unfamiliar to him, a language unfamiliar to him, although in fact it was the heroine's homeland in a past life and the Korean language. He also saw in Jodel's memory an unknown place, previously unidentified to him, which was in fact a pedestrian crossing in the city with a traffic light and poles. He also remembered how he swung his sword at the frightened Jodel in the library, wondering if this was the same gift of the guy whose eyes could look not only into the future, but also into other dimensions. And when he looked at the mysterious and strange man for him, who had previously only been his pursuer and admirer, Ulysses did not understand what exactly was pushing away his strength, what its power was if such a simple-looking guy possessed it. But as soon as the gentleman reached the memory of the kiss that had taken place between them, the white-haired gentleman removed his hand from Jodel's head and thought that it was unpleasant enough for him to remember it. He still remembered how confidently Jodel had told him all the details of the attacker in the library, wondering how someone who hadn't even managed to take half of his power could know so many details. Also remembering how Jodel mentioned Garum and his fake faith in his story, he learned that according to the genealogical tree, he and Jodel are related, which is suspicious. Folding his hands once more, the gentleman calmly said that as he had promised earlier, he would spare Jodel, which caused the main character to stand up from her seat in surprise, asking Ulysses if this was true. Jodel even blushed with delight, asking the Holy King with joy if she needed to disappear from his sight right now so that she would no longer irritate him and cause him problems. But the satisfied and smiling king only said that he would not let him go anywhere again, because now such an important person for the state as Jodel would always be under supervision and close to him. And while the main character waved her hands and told the king with shock on her face that this was not what she wanted, he only said that he would allow her to live her previous life and would also cancel the execution. Imagining herself on her knees and completely alone, Jodel said that she had committed an unforgivable sin and therefore did not want to mislead the king again, and that she could also be called a bad and terrible person. But Ulysses only extended his hand to the heroine and said that now it doesn't matter to him how much the heroine will regret something, because he gives her a chance, because now he sees a completely different person in front of him, and not a pursuer and insidious Jodel. Holding out his hand to the heroine with a white sheet of paper, the king smiled, telling the lady to negotiate, which surprised the protagonist even more. That's why Iona looked at him with big, rounded eyes and an open jaw, not understanding what the Holy King had planned this time. But she realized that now she definitely wouldn't be able to run away and hide from everyone. Having already imagined in his mind a long document with a seal, at the bottom of which there was already a red seal, the king explained that the grace period was 1 year, and he would make a final decision when he saw benefit from Jodel. The long-haired guy looked at the pink-haired lady and said that if she managed to inspire confidence and remove the ones associated with him, while once again proving his gifts of seeing the future, he would let her go and even pay compensation. She was indignant, saying that this was not really a negotiation because it only benefited the king, not her, especially if her life, which she valued, was at stake. But the Holy King smiled at this, addressing her as a boy and telling her that everything depended only on his actions, so he had better try not to upset anyone. Remembering that Ulysses is not a simple person, but the ruling state, who always sits on the throne and makes the most important decisions for Paladin, Jodel realized that it was in front of such a person that she would have to pretend to be a guy for a year and prove her abilities to him. However, before the main character had time to think and put forward her opinion on this matter, the king put a new stack of papers on the table with a loud bang, which caused the uncertain lady to ask him what it was. Placing his hand on the stack of papers, Ulysses said that as soon as the priests in the temple learned that Jodel was not going to be executed, they asked for the heroine to be banished from the kingdom. So the white-haired ruler decided that the protagonist would be completely under his control. Touching the first paper and looking at it, the king said that Jodel would have to obey him unquestioningly, so as not to do stupid things again. And also the agreement between him would not be known to anyone. It would remain only between them. Showing the heroine his easy, sweet smile, the blue-eyed boy explained that it was a kind of coexistence, but he would keep an eye on her every time so that Jodel would not upset him again. Jodel looked at the pen and the contract in front of her very uncertainly, and even as if she was afraid of it, while the king said that if she had any complaints or dissatisfaction, she could now go to execution, and that would be the end of it. But in the end, the girl still took the pen in her hand and told Ulysses that even if he was such a bad person, she would still prove to him that she was telling the truth and would fulfill all the terms of the agreement so that he would believe her. Ulysses only smiled, wishing his interlocutor good luck in her affairs and saying that she would need not only her, but also patience and hard work to prove to everyone her changes for the better. And a few days later, when rumors began to spread around the temple that Jodel had escaped punishment, the three friends were chatting about it, explaining the situation by the kindness of the king, who had pardoned Jodel. Having imagined the most varied houses in the state, Dennett remembered that Ulysses rules not a simple kingdom, but a kingdom that is divided into 4 territories, the first of which, the largest, is residential areas. No less large is the main temple, which has a snow-white interior and columns, which in fact has dimensions comparable to several villages and towns. And the smallest part of the kingdom is occupied by the castle of Ulisses. However, as it turned out, there was also a 4th territory in the state, because as soon as Jodel entered the temple, everyone immediately avoided her, did not come closer than 2 meters, looked at the girl under the guise of a boy with apprehension. And so even when Jodel washed the floors in the classrooms where the students studied, everyone just lifted their feet so as not to touch the floor anymore, thinking that the evil Jodel still had terrible intentions. This is exactly how the girl's everyday life went, which is why at the end of the day, when it was getting dark very quickly, she lay on the bed and yawned from fatigue, thinking about why everyone was avoiding her. She looked at the ceiling with her pink eyes and thought that cleaning was just her hobby. But everyone avoided not only her, but also the place where she cleaned or just walked. Jodel thought that, on the contrary, she could win the trust of her peers and their mood would rise. But everything turned out to be exactly the opposite, because as soon as she appeared next to a crowd of students, they immediately walked away from her. The girl turned over in sadness and began to think about how she had been alone before, referring to her past life, so she wasn't too worried about it. But she still didn't understand what Jodel had done to become famous as a villain. The girl remembered that in her past life she was found as a little girl near a monastery, and from that moment on she lived there, constantly following the nuns and helping them with various jobs, whether it was cleaning or cooking. But when the lady realized that here, just because of cleaning, she was avoided and considered a real criminal, she not only blushed, but was about to burst into tears from hopelessness. Getting out of bed, she wiped the tears from her eyes and thought that there was no need to cry, because it was nothing and she was not really sad, when in fact her soul and mind said the opposite. She decided not only to stop crying, but to believe in herself, which is why she looked forward with determination and clenched her hand into a fist, telling herself that she would not only show everyone her kindness, but also join the company of students. Therefore, being in the temple, above which there was already a dark night sky, Jodel decided to fall asleep quickly, so that by the next day she would have energy and motivation to become better. But even the next day, when the girl picked up a mop and washed the floor with it, she endured various gossip behind her back and the fact that everyone who saw her ran away, because everyone still considered her a crazy boy. Jodel was still busy with work, which is why she was already sweeping the paths near the temple from street dust, thinking about the fact that dreams do not always become reality in one day, so she needs patience and time. Suddenly, the girl's attention was drawn to something that she saw in front of her and at which she looked with surprised, curious eyes. In front of her was the most ordinary door, but the heroine did not remember it at all, as if it had appeared here only now, which is practically impossible in a few days. But when the girl thought that this was a warehouse where she could leave her broom, she noticed there an unusual and large egg which stood on a red pillow, like the main exhibit in a museum. The protagonist was even more surprised by this, wondering where the egg came from, who was growing in it, whether it was alive at all, and why it was being kept here. The egg not only stood on a beautiful pillow, but also flaunted itself on a low column, being completely in the dark, which looked even stranger to the heroine, and she could not understand why it was there. The girl wanted to touch it, so she put her palm on it, talking to the egg and asking it if it was cold, sad, or lonely, as if it could hear her. The next day, when Galvania Gergia was sweeping the paths on the street as usual, Ulysses, who was sitting in the carriage at that time, getting ready to leave somewhere, was calmly watching her. Looking at Jodel, he asked his priest, who was also with him in the carriage, why his subordinate was doing such a useless thing as scraping a broom on the ground. But when the priest asked the king, who was watching Jodel, if he should close the curtain so that he would no longer look at the pink-haired boy with displeasure, Ulysses smiled, showing his mercy, although in reality he prayed that no one would know that he and Jodel were a couple. A man named Hale, who was on the committee to promote Mr. Ulysses' marriage, looked at him, but now he was telling the king that it seemed that when he had looked at Jodel, he had become uneasy. The priest continued to look at the Lord and ask him if he had just looked at Jodel, which made him frown, suggesting that only Jodel could cause mental harm to the king. However, despite the fact that Ulysses was still smiling at Kael, he looked at him with a terrible, displeased look and asked if this was really so, as if hinting to the priest to quickly shut up and not talk about it anymore. Having imagined in his mind what a strange person Jodel had been before all this, Hale told the king that he still found Jodel very disgusting and that it was better to stay away from him so that he would not harm anyone. But also, when the priest asked the holy ruler if something suspicious had happened the other day, Ulysses only touched the curtain with his hands and looked at the view from the window, asking Haley what he meant. When the priest enthusiastically told them that recently an explosion had thundered in their palace, which had scared them, but then they thought that their most holy ruler had found himself a chosen one and had come into contact with her magic, Ulysses only smiled and said that nothing like that had happened. The guy also said with a smile that now was not the time to deal with his bark, but rather to watch the egg so that the sacred beast would hatch from it as soon as possible. But Hale remained silent. Imagining only the silhouette of a unicorn in his head, Ulysses remembered that because sacred animals had become very rare in real life, they had become part of fantasy and legend. But one day the sacred egg was finally discovered, which is why it was given to the state of Palladium, personally into the hands of Ulysses many centuries ago as a sign of friendship. However, since then, the pink egg has not cracked even by 1 millimeter, remaining only on the pillow in a motionless state, which is why doubts began to circulate about its contents. Ulysses thought about this and silently looked ahead, suggesting that it would be better if nothing hatched from this egg at all, because this little animal would only cause trouble later. He recalls that sometimes he even approached the egg and extended his hand to touch it, but each time he quickly pushed his hand away because the egg emitted light and did not allow him to touch it. Just imagining the silhouette of a white dragon in his head, Ulysses remembered that sacred beasts are very proud, and their willfulness has no limits. Kael looked out the window at the view and sadly asked the king what they needed to do to awaken the beast and make it hatch from the egg. He even said that if there was a person who could handle it, he would personally go after him. He even prayed, saying that even if that man turned out to be a terrible criminal, he would pardon him only so that he would awaken the beast. But when Ulysses smiled before him, in fact, he only worried about the egg more. But while Ulysses and the priest were going about their business, the main character was already in the mysterious room with the egg, which turned out to be very dark. But the lady was rubbing her eyes because she felt that something had clearly gotten into them. Looking at the egg in front of her, the girl realized that it was definitely not a chicken egg, because it was white and pink, and also much larger than even an ostrich egg. Showing him her index finger, the pink-haired lady with a broom in her other hand said that she assumed that this might be an egg for the Holy King's meal, since it would be far from an ordinary person who would be able to eat it. However, as soon as the girl said that, the egg suddenly jumped up so high that it really scared the protagonist, who grabbed the broom as if she wanted to defend herself with it. When the living object returned to its place and stood again on the red cushion, the lady only smiled at him, asking if he was offended by his words, and also apologizing to him for it. Jodel also asked the egg how it could answer her and whether it could understand words at all. But it jumped in front of her eyes again and ended up so close to her face that the girl was surprised by this without any words. Throwing the broom on the floor, the girl picked up the egg in her hands and began to examine it with a smile, saying that it was about to hatch, also asking him how the egg ended up here and whether people had locked it here. She even invited the egg to play with her, smiling and happy as she told him that her name was Jodel, and telling the big egg that he probably had a name too. Then, looking with joyful eyes at the cute object, the girl with short hair decided to name the egg Floats, which made her even happier. Noticing that the cheerful egg seemed to like his name too, the girl smiled, telling him that he was her very first friend and that she was incredibly happy that she had a friend. That is why the next day the main character was cheerful and even sang a variety of melodies when she once again swept the roads on the street, because meeting a living egg really lifted her spirits. The girl performed her hobby as if it were a real job every day, but now she did it with joy, because she thought that today she should meet with Flotes, ask how he was doing. But suddenly, the girl was interrupted from her thoughts about the sacred egg by a strange object that she noticed not far from her on the ground, and which most of all resembled a silver pendant that someone had thrown away, which was glittering in the sun's rays. She picked it up and began to examine it curiously, realizing that most likely someone had lost this thing, which meant that it needed to be returned to its owner, since the name Zucchini was written on the pendant itself. Remembering the hall where all the students usually study, the protagonist happily remembered that she had just heard this name during the attendance check, when the teacher announced the names of the employees. So she looked at the pendant with a smile and realized that she had no problem returning it to its owner, and also using this as an opportunity to get closer to her peers and show everyone her kindness. After some time, the main character did just that. She put the pendant on the desk of a student named Zucchini, which is why he, when he first noticed the previously missing thing, picked it up and began asking everyone who put it on his desk. But the pink-haired heroine did not want to tell him that it was she who found his thing, because she did not want to scare him, but only smiled, silently rejoicing that the Zucchini found his pendant, which was very valuable to him, because it came from his grandfather. And after some time, it was time for lunch at the university, because of which all the school children were already in the cafeteria and talking to each other on a variety of topics, except for the main character. Zucchini sat down at the table with his friends and talked about Jodel, that they needed to be very careful with him and be wary of him because he was dangerous. But he didn't suspect that the girl herself heard his words, being nearby. And when a group of friends were talking about how Jodel had once copied their homework, ruined their clothes, or said something rude, they were suddenly interrupted by a brunette who asked everyone to let him speak. The guy sheepishly told everyone that Jodel had recently helped him, which greatly surprised his group of friends, who asked him how this was possible and what exactly had happened. And when the guy told him that Jodel had long ago helped him pay for a call through one artifact, when he urgently needed to contact his parents, but he had no money, Zucchini only banged the table and said that Jodel should still be feared. But when another friend with long hair showed Zucchini the spoon and said with a fake smile that she had just seen him put his pendant back in its place, she said that it was Jodel. She explained her words by the fact that recently in the temple, she saw Jodel picking up something shiny from the ground when he had a broom in his hands, and as usual, he was sweeping everything around. Hearing this, Zucchini began to noticeably get nervous, asking everyone why Jodel needed this, because he was sure that a guy like him definitely had his own insidious plans, which he was going to carry out under the guise of help. But they were all very surprised when they noticed Jodel himself in the dining room, and they began to look at him in surprise and turn away when the main character herself had only come to eat after hard work. And soon the whole gang of teenagers began to stare in all sorts of directions, doing the most ridiculous things like gnawing on a plate, just so as not to see or even look at Jodel. Therefore, the main character had to just sit sadly at an empty table when there were a lot of people around her, but no one wanted to approach her, which is why the girl had to eat lunch alone. Out of the corner of her eye, the girl noticed that a dark-haired guy in glasses was looking at her very suspiciously and as if condemningly, which is why Jodel assumed that she should say hello to him. However, when she did this, greeting Malik kindly, he only turned his head away from her in displeasure and did not even reciprocate, remaining silent as if he too despised the protagonist. And Jodel had to eat alone in silence, which made her want to cry, but she didn't even suspect that at that time another guy with blonde hair was looking at her, who was clearly interested in her. He wanted to say something about Jodel, intending to do it with a smile, but before doing so, he threw a large blueberry over his head so that it landed gracefully in his mouth. However, as soon as the guy caught the berry in his mouth, he himself did not expect how it got stuck in his throat, which is why he instantly hit the table and grabbed his throat, telling everyone that he could not breathe. Many students quickly began to gather around the blonde boy, who tried to say that he needed help. But everyone shouted the student's name to Antonio, and they themselves understood that he was in great trouble. One boy with green hair shouted to everyone that Antonio had something stuck in his throat, and they needed to go to the south wing immediately to call a doctor before things got worse. Everyone had very little time because Antonio was already trying to help himself, hitting his chest in the hope that the stuck berry would come out of his throat on its own. But the blueberry was stuck so hard that no action helped. The main character also looked at the victim, realizing with shock that Antonio could die now, and that something needed to be done quickly before the guy lost consciousness and, even more so, died. As soon as Jodel approached Antonio to help him, he was immediately stopped by other students who were angry at him and told him to move away and not interfere. But the heroine still looked at the blonde. The main character really didn't like the fact that they wanted to stop her. So she said with displeasure that she saw how something got stuck in that guy's throat, trying to tell everyone that he also wanted to help. However, Zucchini still stood in front of him and indignantly said that he had no reason to go there, because he was not even a doctor. And if he tried to help Antonio, he would only harm him, because everyone knew perfectly well who he was. But when Jodel clearly saw that Antonio was about to lose consciousness from lack of air, he broke through the crowd and hurried to help the victim, thinking that he needed to provide first aid and help pull the berry out of his throat. The girl grabbed Antonio's torso from behind and began to press on his stomach harder and harder each time, while everyone around was afraid that the Jodel would harm the student, and some even told others to remove the protagonist from the gift. However, Jodel had no plans to back down, because soon her efforts bore fruit, and she pressed hard on Antonio's stomach before the miracle happened. Everyone immediately looked at Antonio because they noticed that he began to cough very hard and tilt his head forward, also asking him if everything was okay and if he was losing consciousness. The thing is that with each compression of the stomach, the berry freed the throat, which is why Antonio grabbed it, while the main character continued to help him get rid of it. And after the protagonist finally managed to get her way and the berry fell out of Antonio's mouth, ending up on the floor, they both sat on the floor while Antonio coughed and greedily inhaled air, and Jodel couldn't catch her breath. Jodel clutched her head and thanked God that she had been able to help Antonio, also surprised that the knowledge from her past life had come in handy. But as soon as Jodel opened his eyes, he saw two students in front of him, who were looking at him joyfully and saying that Jodel had just managed to save Antonio with his courage and efforts. Even one girl, who had previously believed that the main character was not evil at all, said with delight that it turned out that Jodel had hidden his talent for providing first aid from them. Jodel was also admired by another boy with green hair, who was so surprised by the protagonist's techniques that he asked her to teach him how to save a person's life so quickly and confidently. Jodel couldn't even say a word, but only looked in surprise at the crowd of people who now seemed to have forgotten about her past atrocities, because they now considered her a hero, while Antonio was on all fours next to him and gradually regained his breath. But the girl with pink hair was also surprised that Antonio himself had rushed to tell her something, which made the lady want to turn her head towards him, because she had not heard what the victim was whispering to her. Turning to the main character, the blonde, with tears in his eyes and blush, sincerely thanked Jodel for saving him, considering him a guy and telling her that if it weren't for her, he wouldn't know what would have happened next. However, when the protagonist suddenly stood up from the floor, took her tray of food, and dashed away from the crowd of people, everyone was surprised, not realizing that the girl was very awkward being the center of attention. So Jodel decided to thank everyone and leave. And soon, the pink-haired main character disappeared from the sight of the surprised people, who eventually calmed down, but were still surprised not only by Jodel's heroic act, but also by her disappearance. However, when the girl intended to go with the tray in her hands as far away from people as possible, she dared to look at the one she had seen earlier, or rather at that same guy in glasses who looked at her with contempt, although he was sitting next to her in the dining room. The girl also noticed that the same guy put his foot under her, as if he intended to do everything so that the heroine would trip over his heel and fall, but the lady decided that she would not dare to fall into his trap, because she wanted to jump over it. However, due to her jump, the main character completely miscalculated that she would not be able to control her body at all, which is why she would fall down right on the guy with glasses, while she looked at him with horror in her eyes. Sometime after the main character had clumsily run into the nerd, Ulysses appeared in front of her, pointing his index finger at his head and smilingly telling the lady that she seemed to have a bad memory. The girl was already behind bars for hitting a guy with glasses and making noise, and the Holy King was looking at her, saying that he had explained several times that she was absolutely forbidden to do stupid things. And when the lady tried to explain to the king that she had not done it on purpose, Ulysses simply pulled out sheets of paper in front of her and told her that he would now see what she had done in the past time. Imagining the same guy with glasses in his head, the king read that Jodel was sentenced to 3 hours behind bars for breaking the foot of a student named Theo with her jump. The pink-haired lady did not even raise her head to Ulysses because she was very ashamed when the king read out the reason for the punishment to her in detail in front of her. Also, after reading to Jodel that it would take 8 weeks for Theo to fully recover, the king began to look at the heroine through the bars and think that this boy had too constrained, calm emotions on his face. Remembering that most often he sees Jodel with a broom in his hands, with which he sweeps everything even without gratitude from others, Ulysses realized that before he could believe that he broke the boy's foot intentionally, but now he sees him changing for the better. The blue-eyed guy looked at Jodel and understood that a guy who had suddenly become quiet like him would hardly want to intentionally break someone's foot. However, the king also remembered that when he had recently sat on the throne, a priest had appeared before him and said that he had brought evidence in defense of Jodel, and that it had been provided by the priests Zucchini and Antonio. The priest was near the Holy King and told him that Antonio and Zucchini claimed that Jodel had accidentally stepped on Theo's heel, which the white-haired ruler was very surprised about, still sitting on the throne. Now he looks at Jodel, who is behind bars and does not suspect that she is a girl, but thinks that it was he who saved Antonio's life when he choked on a berry. He scratched his head and began to think about why Jodel now did not want to justify himself, if not only he, but others too, declared his innocence. Then, imagining Jodel under the red sight, Jodel, sighing, told the heroine that now he would be under special surveillance, because if he had not learned more about the situation with Antonio, he would not have done it. And while Jodel was still sitting on her knees and looking at the king, he thought that if he had met Theo somewhere, he would have broken his second heel too, since it was he who had lied to everyone that the heroine had intentionally broken his heel. He just smiled, telling the prisoner that if he ever decided to make a fuss again, he should warn him first so as not to do anything stupid. And when the holy ruler asked Jodel if she had done any other mischief, the girl, disguised as a boy, said that she had recently found a certain egg that could jump and which she had even held in her hands. The blue-eyed king became more serious but was still surprised by Jodel's words, saying that there could not be any strange egg in this temple. At Ulysses' words, the pink-haired lady looked at the king with surprise and anticipation, watching the king's reaction, who clearly suspected something. Frowning, the white-haired, blue-eyed boy asked Jodel if he was talking about that sacred egg, intending to find out from the main character whether she had encountered the most precious relic in the state. But the heroine was only more surprised by this, thinking about the egg itself, not even suspecting earlier that it was a sacred beast, because in appearance it does not have a graceful appearance and is not graceful at all. And when she began to tell exactly what size the egg was, what color it was, and what spots it had on its shell, thus reinforcing the story with the fact that the egg jumped, the king became even more alarmed, asking whether it really did jump. Remembering the same deceiver who had been stealing gold coins from the state treasury for a long time, Uls realized that Jodel could not only predict the future, he also knew how to contact sacred animals. And when the holy ruler told Jodel that he was only a student, not a priest, and that he had absolutely no right to contact sacred objects as a descendant, the heroine became sad, saying that she understood this. But the ruler placed his hand on the grate behind which the sad heroine sat, telling him that he had already been in the position of a student for 6 years and understood that this time had been quite tiring for him. And suddenly, the white-haired ruler told the girl with short hair that it was time to put an end to this, because when he smiled sweetly, he said that it was time to change his position and place of residence. And while the main character was already receiving something more than simple punishments and oppression, Theo, who walks on crutches, walks around the dining room and listens to what some people whisper about him and that Jodel broke his foot. However, as soon as the students started laughing at Theo screaming in pain as his Jodel hurt his leg, he angrily turned towards the priests and ordered them to be quiet with his eyes, which is why they did. Also in the dining room was the main character herself, who was easy to spot because of her pink, short hair, and the students were also talking about her because she had recently been given responsibility for the sacred beast's egg. Jodel sat on the chair and heard conversations about herself, saying that even though she was the one who received the responsibility of watching over the sacred egg, in reality, it was not as majestic as it sounded. Remembering the egg itself, which still sits on a red pillow surrounded by darkness, Jodel recalled that until now no one had hatched from it, which makes her new position not so significant. Imagining a strange, blonde man standing in front of the door, Jodel remembers that everyone avoids working with eggs because of the need to maintain an optimal environment in the dark storage area. It is this man with blonde hair who must watch over the egg, which is why he holds it in his hands, although Jodel knows that this profession has no clear affiliation. Having imagined how this very man is engaged in science and studies it, the heroine realized that he will never be able to do what he loves or do something meaningful. For example, like this, because his job is to look after the egg. Also remembering the guards with iron armor, the protagonist realized that such a person would not be able to become a knight, because his job is to watch over the egg, which does not even move and does not show signs of life. The main character imagined in her head the man who, having packed his bags, runs away from the temple and from the position of caretaker of the sacred egg, because he no longer wanted to do this, because this position remained empty. Jodel exhaled heavily, realizing that now, as she sat in the dining room and thought that the career ladders were closed to her, because even the most experienced magicians could not awaken the sacred beast of their eggs, and she, a simple person, could not do anything with it. But the girl with short hair noticeably perked up when she remembered that Ulisses had not only entrusted her with watching over the egg and looking after it, but in that dungeon he had given her a special assignment. Remembering the way the blue-eyed king looked at her, the girl heard the ruler asking her to awaken the sacred beast from the egg if she was the only hope for that. Taking her dishes in her hands, she looked at them with sadness, remembering Ulysses' words that if she did not wake him up, he would make an omelet out of that large egg, thereby destroying her only friend. But there is also another secret between Ulysses and the heroine, because when she was in prison, the king not only gave her the task of watching over the egg, but promoted her to the position of priest of the temple, which incredibly surprised the short-haired girl. At that moment, the lady was sincerely and incredibly happy about this, because if she now has the status of a priest, she can fully study in the temple and choose the directions to her liking, be it Eastern, Western, Southern, Northern. However, this also means that when the king is in the central part of the temple and the lady is holding the egg and doing something completely different, they will not be able to see each other. But at that moment, sitting behind bars and looking admiringly at the king, Madame asked him which wing exactly she needed to go to, whether she needed to be in the Western wing to do biological research or in the Eastern wing to study science. The king only smiled at this and looked kindly at the heroine, asking if she was really so happy about this news and thought that everything was so simple. And the smile on Jodel's face froze instantly when the ruler clarified that from now on she would be in the central wing, where he was, because she would be under his supervision. The short-haired lady seemed to shrink to the smallest size, imagining the insidious Ulysses who was watching him, realizing with horror that now her whole life would be under the control of one long-haired tyrant. This is what the girl was thinking about, already at the lecture in the central wing. But due to fatigue and deep thoughts, she not only did not listen to the teacher, but also closed her eyes, tiredly wiping her face. But she managed to cheer up for a few moments when a teacher with a book suddenly appeared in front of her, full of rage, who said the name Jodel at the top of his voice, which made the protagonist shudder. The mustachioed man with white hair looked at Jodel indignantly and asked her what he had just talked about, intending to test the student and check if she had been listening to his lecture. Jodel quickly stood up from her desk and began to look in surprise at the teacher who was telling her to answer his question if she had not been listening to his words all this time. He continued to shout, telling the girl that he really, like a lazy guy, was flying somewhere in the clouds and not listening to the lesson at all, if he was sitting almost at the very first desk in front of him. But the short-haired lady was not at a loss, but quickly calmed down, because she began to look attentively at the board behind the teacher in order to answer at least something and not get punished. Having looked at the images of some herbs on the green board, the lady realized that it contained only descriptions of medical techniques and the properties of a wide variety of plants. And also having looked at the main question on the board regarding what kind of tree can be used as the main ingredient for the preparations, the heroine thought, already finding the answer in her head. Remembering in her head one tree that was interesting to the heroine, its green foliage against the blue sky, The girl said that the answer was the mashant tree, and she could explain why. It seems that the teacher did not expect such an answer from Jodel, so he looked at her puzzled, asking why exactly such a tree came to his mind, just as he thought that the heroine was a boy. Imagining in her head a goddess named Marie touching the tree trunk with her hand, Jodel explained that the tree was named after this goddess, who also formed the foundation of the state and laid the foundation for healing in the southern wing. Having also told that the name of the tree means to have the basis of all bases, the pink-haired lady continued to stand while the surprised teacher said that everything was correct and that this was a fairly accurate answer. Even after the lesson, when the teacher with gray hair was in the corridor, he was clearly thinking hard about something, as if one student not only showed his ingenuity, but also made him think about him more. The thing is that in his head he remembers Jodel, who in such a short time became not just a malicious person who only harms everyone, but someone who could easily answer a question regarding biology. But his thoughts were interrupted by the main character herself, who had already called out to the teacher, which is why he looked to the side and noticed with his red eyes the protagonist approaching her. He looked at the man who was running towards him so quickly and diligently, as if he intended to ask him about something. And before that, he had been looking for him everywhere and intended to find only a teacher. The man with gray hair put his hands behind his back and told the student that he was genuinely surprised by his appearance. But he did not advise running towards him so fast, also asking Jodel what exactly he wanted from him while the lady could not catch her breath. Raising her head, the girl with pink eyes and hair told the teacher in surprise that if you mix honey pears with magenta juice, you will get an excellent medicine in the form of tea for a sore throat. But the teacher was not surprised by the heroine's intelligence, and only clarified why the heroine decided that he needed this information, to which the lady in front of him replied that the first time it seemed to her that the teacher had a sore throat during the lesson. Hearing this, the red-eyed man was very surprised because the girl in front of him told the truth, although in fact she learned about the tea thanks to the novel itself, where the main character, who often had a sore throat, drank this tea. After that, he turned away from the pink-haired heroine and looked at her for the last time, saying that he would remember these words, also thanking the lady for her attention and concern. In response, the main character smiled and even blushed a little, already thinking that it seemed she had helped the teacher in some way, and just the thought of it made her smile, and be even happier. After this, when the protagonist found herself in another place, there was a dessert with fig slices on the table in front of her, and the person next to her asked if Jodel wanted to try this delicacy. Jodel looked at the dessert in surprise, not being shocked by its appearance, but rather amazed that one of the students wanted to offer it to her, as if they were real friends. She even pointed her finger at herself, asking the green-haired boy if he was really offering this to her, even though there were absolutely no people around them. The guy told the girl that he decided to give her such a gift because last time the lady caught a bug for him, black and nasty, which is why he decided to please her with sweets with a smile. While the couple sat at the dining room table and talked about how Jodel was not such a bad person as they had previously thought, they were being watched by other people who were also interested in Jodel. They turned out to be another group of students who were watching Jodel and the green-haired guy from afar, talking about why that student decided to befriend the protagonist if he knew perfectly well how cunning she was. But everyone noticed perfectly well that Jodel did not show her terrible character, but smiled so sweetly and sincerely that it seemed that everything around only became brighter when the lady thanked the student for the dessert he gave her. And as soon as the others noticed the charming smile of the main Galerni, everyone's jaw literally dropped and they realized that Jodel was like a ray of light among others, and not a thundercloud that intended to harm others, as before. Within a few seconds, there were already a lot of students around the Jodel girl who intended to offer her a variety of sweets, be it chocolate, candy, or something else, which made the protagonist confused and embarrassed. Taking in her hands absolutely all the gifts from the students, the pink-haired beauty was so successful with what was happening that she could not believe it, did not even try to describe her emotions in words because she looked forward with her jaw, and there were so many students looking at her, happy just because they all gave gifts, that Lei couldn't believe that the people she had helped were now treating her with kindness too. She once again became very embarrassed and blushed, thanking absolutely every single one of the sweets and smiling so sweetly that everyone around was happy just to see the smile of the lady who had changed for the better. And while in the temple, Jodel received not only attention, but also recognition and love from everyone. Theo, whose heel the heroine accidentally broke, was in a completely deserted place, where he finally threw his crutches to the ground. He clenched his teeth in anger when he remembered that Jodel had been appointed not only as a full-fledged priest, but also as the caretaker of the sacred egg, which made the brunette incredibly angry. He was so angry at Jodel that he consciously chewed on his fingers and thought about how he intended to become much better than the pink-haired boy, because he envied him in terms of the protagonist being chosen to be the caretaker of the sacred egg. Realizing that he was the one who should receive recognition from the king because he comes from a family of summoners, Theo, thanks to gnawing his fingers, awakened his own magic, summoning not only a magic circle, but also his beast. After being shocked by the way some dark characters were watching Jodel from afar, Theo realized that he wanted to put Jodel in his place, because even if he had become kinder, he did not trust him and was going to remove him from his position as the caretaker of the egg. And it was the magical beast in the form of a squirrel that allowed Theo to open the closed door to the room with the egg, after which the squirrel looked at its owner, who was already intending to enter and deal with the holy beast. He pushed her aside with his hand, intending to open the doors wider and enter the dark room, telling the squirrel not to make noise and to quickly get lost wherever she wanted, just so that he wouldn't see her. Looking at the egg, which was still sitting on the red pillow, Theo chuckled slyly and smiled, saying that this was just what he needed to carry out his insidious plan. However, before making contact with him, the boy decided to prepare himself by putting on a pink wig, but not taking off his glasses, so that the egg would believe that the true Jodel, his only friend, was standing in front of him. After that, he looked with cunning at the egg itself, because he was going to make only a small crack on the shell of the sacred object and then leave Jodel guilty, as if it was he who had harmed the egg. And he was about to swing at the defenseless egg, as if he was going to crush it against the pillow with all his might, and not just make a small crack, because there was much more anger in his soul than was necessary. However, he was unable to do what he wanted, because the egg was really out of the pillow only thanks to the real Jodel, who grabbed her only friend in her arms and fell to the floor with him, saving him from the blow. An indignant Theo in a pink wig turned his head to Jodel and asked him why he was here again, clearly showing not only displeasure but even greater anger, which caused him to slam his fist on the pillow. And when Jodel said that the egg was just like a living creature that was afraid of pain, Theo only laughed at the heroine's words, asking if she was really pretending to be the egg's caretaker. The indignant lady spoke with pity, saying that Floats was her only friend. Therefore, if he did not want to limp on another leg, she recommended that she move away from him and never touch him again. Noticing that the egg itself began to shake with fear, the pink-haired girl looked at it and tried to calm it down with words, saying that everything was fine and he shouldn't worry. But Theo in front of him continued to laugh at every word Jodel said, asking if he was lewdly ready to harm him just because of some egg, to which the short-haired lady replied that she would protect Floats no matter what. However, when the girl looked more closely at Theo's legs, with which he was slowly moving towards him, the girl realized with great shock that she was not limping at all. Moreover, all his legs were in perfect order. Realizing that the deceiver had also put on a wig only to look very much like a Jodel and deceive the egg, the heroine jumped up from her seat in indignation and was about to tell her opponent all her dissatisfaction. But she was unable to do what she had planned, because the girl fell to her knees again, spraining her ankle and holding the egg even tighter, even more angry that her clumsiness had shown itself at such a crucial moment. And the cunning Theo laughed at this, looking at Jodel with a smile and realizing that the weak heroine would not only not be able to harm him, but also get up from her seat because of her injured leg. That's why he decided not to waste time, but to immediately swing his hand at the defenseless Jodel, who only pressed the egg to her body harder and narrowed her eyes, preparing for a strong blow. But when Theo realized with horror that his hand was no longer going down, as if it had frozen in the air, he froze with surprise on his face and began to shake a little, because he did not understand what was going on. The main character was also surprised by what happened. She clearly noticed that something strange happened to Theo. And the girl also does not understand why her opponent has such a shocked expression on his face. But the pink-haired beauty was even more amazed when Theo fell to his knees in front of her, as if an invisible force had released him and forced him to do so, which is why the attacker screamed loudly in pain. His face was sweating heavily, causing beads of sweat to fall one after another from Theo's chin with each passing second, as if the boy had just experienced a real shock, and the magic that attacked him was much stronger than his own. And the owner of this unstoppable, strong magic is the long-haired king, who looked with his blue, glowing eyes at the offender of the egg, as if the real punishment for Theo would soon come. The first thing the holy ruler did was to address Jodel, telling her that he had not thought that no one would defend the egg, but the heroine's action surprised him, and the lady herself looked at him in amazement, holding her friend in her arms. Appearing before Jodel, the long-haired guy asked both priests what exactly he was doing here, and in such a strange form. But the protagonist could not answer this question right away due to shock and incredible shock. Just as he was about to reach out to Jodel's heel to touch it, the girl began to writhe in pain, and the Holy King realized that most likely the leg was badly damaged and the lady would not be able to walk normally. The serious ruler with blue eyes looked at Jodel and admitted that he needed to be kept a close eye on so that Jodel wouldn't do anything stupid, and he sighed as if from the accumulated problems. But he decided to help Jodel because only one of the ruler's hands began to emit a bright light, as if trying to heal the main character's broken ankle in a matter of moments. And the lady began to look at her own leg in surprise, realizing that it had really healed in such a short time only thanks to Ulisses' strong magic, which is why she reached out to her previously injured leg, wanting to touch it. But after this, the Holy King turned to Theo, who was already on his knees and could not even raise his head to the ruler from shame, realizing that he would receive punishment for his attempts to set up Jodel and harm the egg. When Theo realized that the holy ruler had been watching him and the heroine from the very beginning, he realized that he was the one who saw him earlier, smiling at the egg and already intending to hit it. And also remembering that earlier he wanted to hit Jodel by raising his hand above him. He realized with horror that the Holy King had seen this too, so lying to him now was simply useless. The long-haired king looked at the culprit and said that even though they were students, he couldn't turn a blind eye to what was happening between the two of them. And at that time, Jodel slowly stood up on her feet. Suddenly, Theo cried out with horror on his face that the Holy King had misunderstood everything, and he still wanted to tell his version of events, although in his frightened eyes one could clearly see fear for himself and for the fact that the ruler would punish him. But Ulysses looked at Theo calmly, telling him that if he wanted to tell him something, he wanted to ask him what exactly he intended to do here with the egg, even if he put on a wig for this purpose. And Jodel behind the ruler was indignant, holding the egg in her hands and listening to Theo's words that he sincerely believed that the pink-haired guy did not deserve his position and that he did not have to be responsible for the sacred beast. When Theo told him that if Jodel had kept a closer eye on the egg and really looked after it, he wouldn't have even come in here. But upon hearing this, the egg became very indignant, jumping up and down with anger. And after Jodel had calmed her friend down, the holy ruler asked Theo if he thought that Jodel had no right to watch the egg, and the boy sitting on his knees replied that it was so. But suddenly Ulysses put his hand on his chest and said with a smile that it was all his fault, because he was the person who appointed Jodel to watch over the egg, which he confessed to Theo. And when the owner of the Palladium said that it was he who had made a mistake in his decisions, such great surprise appeared on Theo's face that he turned completely pale when he learned that Jodel had carried out the orders of the ruler himself. But the gentleman continued to smile, telling the stunned Ulysses that despite all this, the egg itself, the sacred beast, had chosen Jodel as its friend. So it was no wonder that it was the heroine who was next to the relic. Sometime after this, when it was 8 o'clock in the evening and all the students had finished their classes, the main character was already following the master to the sacred temple with snow-white columns. The pink-haired lady with short hair looked at the interior with surprise and admiration, because it was in such a beautiful place that Ulysses lived, also amazed that it was her that he decided to invite here. But when the king turned around to ask the Jodel why he had stopped, although in fact the lady was looking at the interior, she began to run up to the ruler and catch up with him, shouting that she was already following him. A few minutes later, the long-haired guy had already brought the main character to his office, or rather, to the snow-white high door, already about to open it. But the lady does not understand for what reason exactly he called her to his office. She recalled how the previously angry, but as usual smiling gentleman warned that there was no need to make noise. So Madame assumed that Ulysses was going to scold her personally for the situation in the room with the consecrated egg. Therefore, the insecure and fearful girl told the gentleman that even if he intended to scold her once again, she wanted to tell him that Theo was going to kill the egg, and she saved it. But when the gentleman forced the heroine to sit down on the blue sofa while telling in a monotonous voice, Métiel, he is not so stupid as not to recognize Theo's evil intentions from the very beginning, so he does not ask the girl to explain. The blue-eyed ruler's words made the lady fall silent, only watching as he wanted to take a closer look at her injured leg, which made her blush slightly. Noticing that the king even put on white gloves before touching Jodel's leg, the lady indignantly said that she does not carry any germs, so there is no need to be so careful. But the thoughtful gentleman said that he had healed most of the wound with magic and did not want to touch it with dirty hands. The surprised lady watched as the king touched her heel and said that he also had personal reasons for touching others with gloves, which made the short-haired lady remember that Ulysses, according to the novel, did not like contact with people. So, wearing white gloves, the ruler would sometimes press on the painful, injured areas of Jodel's leg and ask if she was in pain there, doing so with the utmost care and precision. And the main character squinted and frowned from the unpleasant sensations, because she really was in pain, which she told Ulysses, saying that there was a lot of pain in that place. Remembering how the ruler had cast a spell on Theo that stopped all his body movements, Ulysses said that he had done it, so there was no need to worry. And he also understood that if his heel hurt, then Jodel was feeling it now too. But when Jodel wanted to sincerely express her gratitude to the king, which caused her to blush sweetly and look away, this not only surprised Ulysses, but also seemed to make him feel just as touched by the heroine as the students did in the dining room. So he looked at the face of the main character with fascination on his face, as if it had touched him more than anything else. Also surprised that such an earlier evil and bad person like Jodel had improved for the better. After that, he tilted his head down with a slight embarrassed smile on his face, telling Jodel that he was a great guy, and that these were the right words, not even suspecting that the protagonist was actually a girl. And when the treatment of the heel came to an end, the ruler of the sacred state looked at Jodel again and said that he had completely cured his leg from dislocation, and so asks not to break anything else on the exam, like today. Hearing the words pyro exam from the king, the pink-haired lady was horrified when lightning seemed to flash around her and everything began to collapse, because only now did she remember such an important thing as an exam. Because before the ankle was healed, the couple stood before the guilty Theo, who sat on his knees in front of them and listened to Ulysses' words about how the sacred egg personally chose Jodel, and therefore it was the main character who would look after it. From this news, Theo's whole body began to tremble, and real shock was visible on his face. So he asked the king how this was possible, because he tried with all his might to show that he was better than Jodel in front of the king himself. But suddenly another man, a teacher with gray hair, burst into the temple, opened the door with lightning speed, and shouted whether the sacred beast had really chosen a priest of Jodel. The first to be frightened by the teacher's appearance was the main character, who hid on the king's back, who also looked at the elder and held his hand raised so that Jodel would not worry too much. In his head, Ulysses remembered the words of Haley, with which he promised that if someone was found who would know how to help the sacred egg, he would personally ride this lucky person on his shoulders throughout the country, which Ulysses imagined in his head. And Kyle himself remembered the words, namely, how he prayed to God that at least the criminal could awaken the sacred egg, because even if he were the most terrible in the world, he would forgive him, if only the sacred beast would be born. But now Hale looks at Jodel with the king and Theo, shouting that he categorically disagrees with the final decision, as if he doesn't really trust the main character completely and thinks that anyone else can handle her task better. He kept looking at the king and asked him to choose a caretaker for the egg through formal testing, and not just because it jumped when it saw the protagonist in front of it. So it was Hale who suggested that each candidate be rated, which made the pink-haired lady already imagine herself as a very cute, heart-showing lady who seemed to be asking for many people to vote for her. But when the lady imagined a formidable teacher above her, who disliked her more than anyone else, because he did not trust her, considering her the very person who could make insidious plans and machinations. The first thing that will be tested in the assessment is the knowledge of the priests, which is why the lady imagined a pen with papers in her hand, because everyone needs to write a written exam on their knowledge of the history of the Palladium, which is almost the most important thing. And after the exam on the history of the state, there is a physical exam, where everyone must demonstrate their endurance, strength, and preparation by running, jumping, or other exercises. The third stage in the evaluation of candidates is a treasure hunt in the high, tree and grass-covered terrain, while avoiding the traps of the so-called Lacras mountain range. After the participants manage to find valuable treasures behind the ridge, having overcome the most dangerous traps, they must take only the most precious in their opinion from all the treasures, stones, gold, and pearls. Imagining herself with an egg that seemed to emit a magical light, the heroine realized that all this was being done so that the participants would demonstrate resilience to critical situations in order to protect the beast. But the white-haired ruler was thinking about something else, because he understood that most likely the sacred beast would not choose another person, since it had already become attached to Jodel. but he still believed that official competitions would help get rid of the alarming consequences. Now the girl was sitting on the blue sofa in front of the priest and asking him if he would be able to complete all the tasks, because he had heard that Theo was a descendant of powerful magicians and summoners. Looking away, the blue-eyed boy sighed and said with a smile that even Theo would never have thought of kissing him on the lips. So he thought that Jodel would win even him, a hereditary summoner with his unpredictability and determination. However, the king also looked at the main character with a calm gaze and said that he was not worried about her, if Jodel had previously thought that this was the case. The surprised heroine raised her head and looked at the ruler, asking him what exactly he meant, as if she did not expect to hear this from the one who helps her and even protects her from trouble. Ulysses only remembered how Jodel defended the egg at the cost of her health, holding it close to her, telling the protagonist that he was sure that a student like him was obliged to pass the exams because he had fiercely defended his friend before. The pink-haired lady was surprised, asking the king if he heard her voice at the moment when she rushed to protect the egg, also saying that the ruler said everything correctly, because the sacred egg is not just an object for him, but a friend. The girl remembered the egg that she had happily held in her hands a couple of days ago, telling Ulysses that they had become friends for a long time and that she had even given him the name Floats, which the sacred beast really liked. She realized that she really wanted to stay close to her friend, so she remembered the complex structure of the mountain, which made her realize that moving around it would not be an easy task. And besides, monsters lived there. However, when the lady imagined the mysterious eyes of the beast in her head, she realized that if she used one secret of this mountain, she could easily win. Still sitting on the sofa, the lady with the short hair remembered that on that mountain there lives a sleeping monster, who not only kills strangers but burns them for any extra sound because he is sensitive to them. Thinking about this, Madame Et imagined how a simple person would gradually be consumed by the monster's fire, which looked scary, and Jodel was afraid that this could happen to her too. But her thoughts quickly turned to an unusual, beautiful blue flower called saffron, because she remembered that if she let the monster smell it, he would fall into a deep sleep and never wake up again. However, she continued to think, because the flower is not so easy to find, because it is also valued in the world, like jewelry, which is why the lady thought that saffron is better used as a treasure and not a sleeping pill for a monster. Having imagined a map, a mountain on it, and many forests, in the center of which a red cross is marked, Jodel knows, thanks to the plot, that this flower grows right next to the monster itself, which is dangerous and risky. Glancing briefly at the king, the girl realized that asking Ulysses for help in finding that very flower would be dishonest. And even now, according to the story, no one has yet discovered it, because this will not happen anytime soon. But she was also worried that Theo would end up winning, which she really didn't want, because such a smiling, cunning, and malicious Pacaner like him would definitely want to harm the egg. The main character asked Ulysses about this, asking what she would do if she lost the assessment, to which the king responded with a sharp blow to the back of the sofa next to the protagonist's head, telling her in addition that there was nothing she could do then. Looking with his blue eyes at the heroine, the king asked if Jodel really thought that he would resort to cheating and change the results of the assessment just for him, addressing the lady as a boy. But unexpectedly, Jodel also spoke out with anger on her face, saying that she was also against the king helping her, because it was unfair and did not show her true capabilities, endurance, strength. At this point, the lady remembered how she stole the king's first kiss and thus played unfairly, although now she understands that then her life was on the line and she had to do it. But now, there is no need for this. Leaning slightly towards the lady, the ruler asked her if he then considered that her life was more important than his sincere, heartfelt requests and problems, to which the pink-haired madam replied that of course it was. And as soon as the heroine realized what she had just said, she immediately began to scream that it was not so, and that she had not wanted to say that at all. But King Ulysses only smiled, looking away. Once again imagining the dark silhouette of a unicorn in his head, the king said that sacred animals are very demanding and have great pride, so they do not obey even him. This is what the blue-eyed Mr. Jodel was telling her, looking at her with great charisma, saying that the sacred beasts do not obey even him. Therefore, the person who awakens the sacred beast will be considered the chosen one. With his hands folded, the holy king told the heroine that he was confident that she would succeed, but there was one more thing he wanted to talk about, and which he had not talked about before. As soon as Ulysses began to tell her what exactly to do in cases where the heroine was harassed or harmed, The lady clenched her hand into a fist and said herself that she understood perfectly well that she needed to avoid conflicts and be an obedient student. But, closing his eyes, the king said that it would be best for him to beat the offenders back, because he already had a very frightened, weak appearance, which the heroine was outraged by, asking the ruler if this was really so. But he assured that it was true. The lady continued to look at the strange gentleman in front of her, who, with his hands folded, smiled at her, not understanding whether this man was kind if he treated her so kindly and carefully, and whether he was evil if his voice was almost always stern and his orders harsh. Still smiling, the blue-eyed guy said that he also feels pain in his body when Jodel gets injured, and thanks to this, he gets more and more new experiences in life, for which he thanks the lady, because these sensations are always new for him. The pink-haired lady was slightly embarrassed, scratching her cheek with her finger and smiling sweetly at the gentleman, taking his words as a sincere compliment. But suddenly, when the gentleman was still smiling, but everything around him had become red and dark, Ulysses said in a serious voice that Jodel did not need to go and break all her bones in this case just because of his gratitude. The lady nodded fearfully when the king thanked her for the extra trouble, but she still tried to understand what the ruler wanted to say, whether he meant that he had fun with the protagonist. However, when she looked at the king, who until now seemed to her a very inaccessible and mysterious person, who folded his arms and said nothing more, Lindy realized that he was far from an unambiguous person. Even when the Lord asked Jodel to give him her hand, the girl was afraid as if the king was going to harm her. So she looked at him in shock, asking why he needed her hand. But the holy ruler himself remained indifferent, explaining that he needed to measure the sacred power of the main character, and therefore invited the girl to place her hand on his palm. They both started to walk around the room as the pink-haired heroine asked the king in surprise why he needed her power, and he replied, waving his hand, that he should already know all the basic information about Jodel, including her power, if they were now connected. The guy continued to talk, saying that he wanted to know not only the size of Jodel's seed, but also how useful it could be, while Lay herself was behind him at that time, silently listening to the explanation. After this, the protagonist noticed a blue, levitating ball above her head, which she looked at with surprise, amazed that she had not previously known that sacred power was measured precisely by it. Remembering not only Ulisses, but also the book, the Jodel, into which she had found herself, the lady recalled that in it he did not have to measure his sacred power, and therefore this was not described in history. Ulysses himself is an ideal character and the main hero in the story, because he does not even have a last name, but he has an incredible appearance with long hair and an equally attractive character. All priests worship Ulysses as a sacred god, and if they want to become these same priests, they must renounce their family name and family to be like the holy ruler, who also does not have this. Because of this, the lady with short hair thought, remembering that it was precisely for these reasons that she first heard her last name only in the dungeon, when she was not yet a priest. And it sounds like Jovohilda. But as soon as the gentleman noticed that Jodel was distracted from the process for even a minute, he immediately grabbed her by the face and ordered her to concentrate, because he had the gift of the future, which would also be very useful. In addition to this, the Holy King also remembered that it was Jodel who was able to break the barrier of the sacred beast and get closer to it when he couldn't even touch it because the egg was emitting a scorching light. That is why in the past, the king, being interested in the power of Jodel, wanted to see some records about it, and therefore opened the papers, but nothing was said in them about his sacred power. Imagining the past, the treacherous Jodel with bad intentions, the holy ruler remembered that he had previously believed that he had used his family's power in order to get into the temple and serve in it, because the king quickly remembered the duchy of Exiled and realized that Jodel's family was so influential that it was a duchy on the continent. And the ducal family of Jovohilda, consisting of the father, mother, and Jodel himself, is more influential than the imperial one, because they themselves are ancient descendants of the imperial family. But when the long-haired boy looked at Jodel, he understood that his ducal family was famous not only for its power, but also for the fact that, together with the imperial family, they carried out all sorts of machinations, bloody and dishonest. However, now the young man looks at the seemingly innocent man with short pink hair, who only wants to be reunited with his friend, and wonders if he will be able to use the same incredible spells as the king. The girl briefly remembered that when the Holy King left the kingdom on a white horse on business, he always scattered his blessing on everyone as a gift from him personally to the people. Imagining Ulysses, on a white horse, already stretching out his hand to the side in order to bless everyone, The lady realized that this was a very exciting moment, not only for her, but for all the inhabitants of the kingdom. Now, this man asks the protagonist to give him her hand so that he can then touch the magical blue ball and finally understand how unique she is, how strong Jodel's holy power is. And as soon as the girl did this, touching the extraordinary ball with her palm, the light from it became many times stronger, and the pink-haired lady herself looked at it with shock and delight, because she also wanted to know how strong her sacred power was. But soon the lady fell to her knees, clenching her hands into fists and realizing that she did not feel any sacred power at all, despite the fact that the ball began to glow like a lantern immediately after Jodel's touch. The holy ruler also looked at the heroine, who was already wondering if Jodel had really helped the Gers in something, which is why the protagonist now has no power. But he also understood something else. Looking more closely at the ball, which was still devastating, Ulysses realized that if it did not react in any way to the holy powers of Jodel, it meant that there was either too much of it, which is why he could not count it, or it was insignificantly small. The serious-minded gentleman looked at both the main character and the ball, saying to himself, "This is definitely not the first option, because he does not believe that there is someone stronger than him, especially since no one has ever met such a strong priest." Because of this, he remembered the sacred snow-white temple, assuring himself that such a stupid person as Jodel certainly did not possess incredible power, because, most likely, on the contrary, there was so little of it that it was practically non-existent. When the ball was in its place and Jodel was still sitting on the floor, the long-haired gentleman decided to ask his student a couple of questions, first clarifying whether Jodel knew any spells. Not having received a clear answer, the gentleman folded his arms and looked for what in this case would have to be special training personally for Jodel, which surprised the girl greatly. The lady was so shocked that she looked at the king with amazement and asked if this was really so, to which he replied that since it would be very useful in the test, he should at least learn the basic skills if the spells were very weak. But sometimes Ulysses remembered the tenderness and kindness with which Jodel held the sacred egg in her hands, realizing that thanks to friendship and connection with it, the protagonist could still gain some magic. And when Jodel stood up and looked at the Holy King, he suddenly extended his hand to her again and said that he would now share his holy power with her. And he also asked the heroine how best to do this. The pink-eyed girl continued to look at him in surprise as he asked her if he needed to transfer his power to her through a kiss or if there was another way. And the gentleman himself was surprised when the girl in the form of a boy in front of him said that this should not be done, because in that case it would not be her strength, and the game and all the evaluation would be unfair. And the lady also clenched her hands into fists from determination. Instead of agreeing to quickly, but unfairly, seize the holy power directly from the hands of the strongest ruler, the lady put her hand on her chest and said that she herself wanted to become stronger, so she asked the master how to do this. Slightly surprised, but still calm, Ulysses sat down at his desk and told the regent that in that case she needed to come here every day at 8 o'clock in the evening so that he could teach her everything she needed. And sometime after that, when early in the morning there was already an advertisement on the bulletin board for the evaluation for the selection of the person responsible for the sacred beast, which should already be able to pay a lot of attention. Around one piece of paper, a great many students gathered, who began to read the announcement with admiration and interest, and also to discuss those who would take part in this competition. The dark-haired guy and the other blonde were talking to each other about the rumors that it was Jodel who broke the sacred egg, viciously and fearlessly, although this is just gossip. But also watching from afar behind the crowd of priests near the notice board was the gray-haired Kael, who remained silent with a sullen face, listening to the students gossiping about Jodel and how he wanted to harm the egg. Remembering in her head the unlucky Jodel, who looked like a madel chick to everyone and hid in the bushes, Kael is happy, because the difficulty of all the tests will force the main character to try to win, to show all her strength. With such thoughts, the teacher walked through the deserted places near the temple, where there was not only a pleasant, relaxing shade, but also a garden near the snow-white columns. But all his thoughts were interrupted when he heard fleeting, strange rustling sounds, to which he turned his attention, already searching with his red eyes for the source of the noise. The thing is that not far from the walking teacher, there was also the main character, who was carrying a large bowl of something in her hands, which is why the short-haired lady carried it very carefully, passing by the trees. He noticed something strange in the protagonist's hands, and upon closer inspection, he realized that Jodel was carrying the fruits of the grinnis plant in her hands. But he did not understand what exactly the protagonist intended to do. Looking at one such fruit growing on a tree, the teacher remembered that not only does it emit an unpleasant aroma, it is also tasteless. And as it ripens, all its properties only become worse. The teacher wanted to stop Jodel because he assumed that she was completely unaware that eating this would give her a severe stomachache. But he was amazed when the girl began to throw the fruit on the ground and call out to someone. As it turns out, the protagonist brought some fruit to several white rabbits so that they could eat. But this did not calm the teacher, who noticed this and wondered if these animals would get a stomachache. She hid behind a tree so that Jodel would not notice him and continue doing her business, which Kyle observed, amazed by the kindness, strangeness, and suspiciousness of the heroine's actions. But when the rabbits ate the fruit, they did not feel any discomfort, but began to roll on the ground and lie down on it, because they had already filled their stomachs with the delicacy, wanting to relax on the warm green grass. The main character watched them, smiling sincerely and rejoicing at the rabbits, who over time began to jump onto her shoulders and sit next to her, which made the girl even happier. But what surprised Kyle most was that the fruits did not cause stomach pain in animals, which is why he looked at the ground in shock and could already believe that the fruits also did not affect humans in any way. When the teacher realized that it seemed that Jodel had steamed the fruits, thereby removing the toxins from them, allowing the rabbits to eat them without ill effects. But he also remembered how Jodel had previously saved a student in a way no one had ever seen before, which had surprised him immensely. After seriously considering Jodel's skills, he realized that he really wanted to test them as soon as possible, because thanks to the protagonist's actions, he saw that the heroine was an incredibly unusual and unique student. So the main character's calm day passed, after which she attended the lessons of the Holy King, who taught her everything she needed with a pointer in his hands, with which he ordered the heroine to redo everything if there was even one mistake. And the next day, the lady was already carrying food for the rabbits in a large bowl, but already with an unbearable fatigue in her body, wondering whether Ulysses ever gets tired, if he rules the country during the day and teaches it in the evening. Once again, the protagonist sat on the grass and threw fruits at the animals, also remembering floats, thinking about how the holy egg was doing without her, since they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The girl's mind flashed with memories of Theo swinging at her to hit her, because the lady realized that right after that incident, the security of the holy egg had been strengthened, making it almost impossible to approach it. The excited lady looked at the grass with her pink eyes, thinking that she had no idea that in the storage room where the egg was, there was a protective barrier that was incredibly difficult to destroy. Remembering how her only friend was still on the red pillow, surrounded by darkness, the lady wondered if the time she managed to break into the vault was because the sacred beast itself allowed her to do so. But while the heroine was thinking about this, also sneezing because she has an allergy to wool, which fortunately does not affect her abilities, an angry Hale was watching her with red eyes, but Jodel already guessed that someone was watching her. Therefore, when the girl directly asked the mysterious man behind the tree why he was following her, the teacher began to shout indignantly and ask the heroine how she noticed him and whether she had eyes on the back of her head. But the pink-haired beauty had to turn around with lightning speed and a shocked, frightened face because she heard behind her the sounds of Hale falling, having raised his leg unsuccessfully and impaled himself on a stick, while the heroine was amazed that the teacher had been watching her all this time, and not the Holy King whom Jodel was used to seeing everywhere and who could pursue her. As it turned out, the man actually fell on the grass, which is why he began to touch his back and feel painful, unpleasant discomfort, which is what the stunned main character saw in front of her. Running up to him, the pink-haired lady asked Hale if he was okay, causing the teacher to get angry, yelling at Idol that he hadn't given her permission to call him by his name yet, much less address him informally. However, when the priest's palm touched the grass and suddenly the man's finger was pierced by a small branch, the gray-haired teacher cried out in pain, grabbed his hand and told the heroine that he now had a splinter in his hand. The astonished girl looked at the priest and was surprised not only by the unexpected situation, but also by the fact that Kyle had been watching her for several days for some reason. But she immediately understood what to do, and so she ran in an unknown direction, telling him that she would return soon. But the old man, lying on the grass, shouted that they shouldn't leave him here alone, especially with a wound. When Jodel ran after something, the gray-haired old man was already crawling on the grass and screaming in horror, saying that he was terribly afraid that the splinter would get into his blood vessels, and then into his heart, because of which he would die. However, the old man was very surprised that Jodel did not call anyone for help, but simply plucked something from the tree branches, holding it with her little fingers and examining it with pink eyes, while the stunned Kyle asked her what he wanted. And when the lady came closer to the priest, saying that if you apply this flattened berry to the wound, the splinter will come out by itself. But Kyle was afraid, asking the girl if he thought he would trust him, assuming that the heroine was a boy. The girl with big eyes looked at Kyle and seriously said that he just needed to trust, and then the splinter would come out on its own thanks to the berry. This greatly surprised the gray-haired old man, which is why he looked at her with shock while she continued to say that he had nothing to lose anyway, so he should at least try to do it as soon as possible. And what was the priest's surprise when the splinter actually came out of his wound very quickly, leaving only a small wound, which is why Kyle looked at his hand as a new miracle of nature. He, with a thoughtful look, told Jodel that it was very impressive, and he was surprised by her strange but working methods of help, which made the lady happy, saying that it was wonderful, laughing sweetly. But just as unexpectedly, the priest threw a very small black thing towards the heroine, which she was already about to catch with both hands and examine more closely, asking Kyle what it was. However, the teacher had already hurried to calmly leave the garden, as if nothing had happened, telling the girl that she might eat it or she might not, which created even more questions for the lady than before. And before Jodel completely disappeared from sight, the white-haired priest said that she could still just call him Kyle, because he was always ready to meet the youth halfway, supported their ideas. But the pink-haired lady was only surprised at how the old man could walk and run so quickly. Having looked more closely at the object in her hands, the lady realized that Kyle had decided to give her a small gift, because he had thrown her a beautiful candy in a wrapper, thus thanking her for saving her from a splinter. From that day on, every time the pink-haired lady went to the garden and fed the animals there, Hale would come to her and ask all sorts of questions, pointing his finger at her and asking, for example, if she knew what was contained in the roots of the urca plant. Then, imagining that very plant above the priest, the lady answered that this cannot be done because there are poisonous components there, and they are dangerous if you touch them, which is why it is important to remove all the roots. Every time the girl answered the old man exactly like that, she saw before her the still dissatisfied, gray-haired teacher who accepted Madame's answers and then thought that Jodel was a good student and knew a lot. And the protagonist looked at him with a sweet smile on her face, realizing that now she is a good student, which can please not only herself but also others, because it is the priests and Hale who are most surprised by her successes. Holding a large bowl in her hands, the pink-haired lady also said that this plant was also used as an excellent medicine, if combined with the leaves of another plant. To which Hale replied that this was good knowledge, placing his hands on his hips. Every day a teacher came to the main character and gave her candy every time for answering his questions correctly. But after a while, when the assessment had already begun, there were many priests near one area, talking. However, the student with glasses, who was holding the papyri in her hands, approached Kyle and asked him if everything was okay, because it seemed to her that something serious had happened to him. Looking out the window, the old man laughed calmly and said that everything was fine, but they both understood perfectly well that the old man was clearly thinking deeply about something. He looked angrily at the student with red eyes, as if he did not want her to walk next to him, but wanted to be left alone with his thoughts. However, the girl with brown hair and glasses looked at the teacher with surprise, not understanding why Hale was acting so strangely. The thing is, Kyle was remembering Jodel, who had recently saved him from a splinter in his finger, but he was thinking that lately she had been showing much more results than many of the students in the temple. It was with these thoughts that the gray-haired old man looked out the window, examined the foliage and the glare of the sun, thinking that the upcoming assessment would show not only interesting results, but also unexpected conclusions and facts. Gradually, day after day passed, and the main character trained more and more. But when she sat at the table and held a cup of tea in her hands, she noticed that she was getting more and more worried about the competition. Also worried about the fact that she hadn't seen Theo for a long time, the lady imagined how the Holy King would punish the guilty one with magic, which made the girl worried that it was Ulisses who could make such a decision. But over time, the heroine learned that Theo was put under house arrest for 3 weeks, which is why he could not leave such a gray room, where there was a small tar with different bottles, pots, and old boxes. Imagining a pensive Theo looking out the window from his locked room, Jodel guessed that with the assessment just around the corner, he certainly wouldn't sit back and just wait. Also in her room, bright and minimalistic, Jodel continued to sit at the table and drink tea until she heard knocks on the door, which made her surprised, not understanding who was asking to visit her so late when it was already dark outside. Getting up from the table, the pink-haired girl went closer to the door in order to look through the peephole and see who her guest was. And thanks to him, the shocked lady saw Theo himself, who was standing in front of her door with a serious face, while behind him was already an unknown person whose face was difficult to see. The lady was even more surprised when Jodel shouted to Theo from the other side of the door that he had come to apologize for his behavior and that he had brought him a gift that he wanted him to accept, because he was giving it to him from the bottom of his heart, addressing the protagonist as a boy. But the girl with short hair did not believe Theo's words, but only became wary, angry, wondering whether this guy wanted to laugh at her or joke. She continued to stand near the door as Theo did on the other side, but she did not decide to open the door to the man who, a few days ago, was ready to kill not only her, but also the sacred egg. And while the main character was thinking that Theo definitely wanted to secretly find out how she was preparing for the exam, the boy himself turned around and looked at the priest, who was writing something on paper with a pen. And despite all the doubts and suspicions, the main character decided to open the door for Theo, after which she smiled at him and asked what had happened, why exactly he decided to come at such a late time. But Theo only handed the main character a basket with some items, telling her angrily that he had just said that he had come to apologize to him, giving her the basket as a gift. At this, the pink-haired lady smiled her sweetest, asking Theo if it was lewdly so, thus extending her hand to the curious basket, in which there were more gifts for her. Theo looked at Jodel with some mockery, asking her if she didn't know that he had come to apologize, and he also asked how long he would keep him on the doorstep as a guest. However, when the girl clarified what the guy meant, Theo became confused, looking back and speaking to the protagonist more softly, apologizing for his harshness and explaining that he said the wrong thing. But the pink-haired lady also looked at the unknown priest with the papers in his hands, loudly and decisively saying that he would still let him visit him and make him tea, addressing herself as a boy. As it turned out, Theo brought the main character the simplest gift set, which contained various spices, fruit syrup, a jar of tea leaves, which Jodel might like. She still decided to brew tea for herself and Theo from the tea leaves that had been given to him, which is why after a while the girl was already putting cups on the table while the guest with glasses silently waited and looked at her. But the expectations that Theo could have added poison or toxin to her tea were not realized, because it looked ordinary and remarkable. And Theo himself drank it all, after which he left. With her hands on the table, the short-haired lady looked suspiciously and warily at the other objects in the room, because she understood that if she did not find any catches in the tea, she had doubts about other things. Because the main character was looking at a minimalist nightstand on which lay a large piece of paper, which the lady was looking at, already intending to approach it and examine it closer. She recalled that Theo stayed near this table for a very long time because Madame had placed her own map with her own notes on it in advance, on which she had developed a plan for completing the exam. She took the card in her hands and quickly realized that the guy didn't need to apologize to her because he actually wanted to know her plans for the exam when he didn't care at all whether Jodel would forgive him or not. And the next day, when that very exam was taking place, a lot of priests gathered around one snow-white arena who really wanted to take part in the assessment of whether they would become caretakers of the holy egg. Jodel was already at the start and clutched her head, asking herself if she could overcome all the obstacles and win. But behind her was someone who was more confident in himself than anyone. It was Theo, who looked at Jodel in the start with eyes wild with anticipation of victory, telling himself that he was not only better than the main character, but better than everyone else. And that was why he would win the marathon. He imagined in his head how, with a crazy face, efforts, and motivation, he was sitting at his desk and writing a written exam, already convinced that the results were obvious, because he would win. But unlike Theo, who was maniacally obsessed with winning, the pink-haired girl only intended to run forward with a determined expression on her face because she was fixated only on her goals. However, what was Theo's surprise when it was written on the notice board that, according to the results of the written exam, the best student was Jodel, and Theo was only in second place. And as soon as Theo saw this, he began to tremble with anxiety and disappointment, pointing his club at the sheet of paper with the results, which made him literally tremble from the understanding that he was no better than everyone else in the temple. The very next moment he turned back with lightning speed, because anger and malice appeared in his soul, because he intended to express all his dissatisfaction to the judges and prove that something definitely went wrong. However, when he turned around, he saw his main enemy, Jodel, who was surrounded by other students and was smiling, blushing, because everyone was praising her for her success and complimenting her. At that moment, everything around this crowd and Jodel herself disappeared, became darker and more gloomy, because Theo noticed only them, gradually feeling in his soul all the most unpleasant and terrible feelings. Theo himself was alone and seemed abandoned by everyone, although he tried no less on the written exam than Jodel, even having a manic desire to be better than everyone else. But reality shattered all his dreams into small pieces. Out of anger and rage, he clenched his fist very tightly and began to wonder why this happened and how he was different from others, because of which he now did not receive the same attention as Jodel. His red anger, which could seemingly consume everything around him, surrounded Theo as he sternly looked ahead and promised all the priests and teachers that nothing would be as Jodel wanted it, because he intended to try even harder. But while the crowd of priests was praising and admiring Jodel, there was also the Holy King sitting on his throne, watching everyone from afar with silence and mental inferences. He looked at Jodel in the crowd with his blue eyes and thought that at first he thought that his student would not show great results. But now even he was surprised, because Jodel turned out to be better than all the participants. The ruler did not take his eyes off Jodel, who was laughing with everyone, and who was already in the company of good friends who supported her and were always there, which made the lady even blush. But most of all, Jodel was pleased with the results of Kyle, who looked at Heroine with enthusiasm and hope, as if with his gaze wishing for her victory and overcoming of all difficulties, which the long-haired king next to him also noticed. After some time before the evaluation, the ladies decided to sit down under a tree and breathe a sigh of relief. But in her head, there were still worries about whether she would be able to win, to achieve being next to floats. Sometimes the lady would be sad and look at the egg, which was beautifully placed on the stone structure, as a prize that would be given to one winner in all competitions. She also remembered the flower that she intended to find in the mountains, doubting whether her plan would be successful because the area was very dangerous. But she knew that she had to try anyway. Besides the competition, the girl was also thinking about the whole contract with the Holy King, which she signed at the very beginning, and which stated that in 1 year she must win his trust. But she also needs to find a way to get rid of the connection that appeared between them after the kiss, which made the lady remember that moment when the blue-eyed king looked at her and talked about the connection. However, as soon as the heroine thought about the Holy King, he himself appeared next to her without making a single noise, causing the shocked girl to look at him and shudder. Ulysses remained calm, telling the protagonist that she needs to get herself in order as soon as possible, because the exam and the marathon itself will begin soon. And this is the last exam that will determine the winner. The girl nodded resolutely, thinking that she really should stop doubting herself and should throw all extraneous thoughts out of her head, making every effort to win. Looking at the egg, which was still in its place, Jodel realized that it was only for this reason that she wanted to get the highest score and continue to be close to Floats, because he was her best friend. Therefore, the heroine hastened to reveal her map, remembering that at the last stage she was required to find the treasure somewhere in the mountain range and then bring it back. When the Holy King was still next to her and Jodel was looking at the map on the grass, she thought that the treasure, according to the rules of the competition, could be anything that she considered valuable. However, remembering the eyes of that very dangerous beast, the girl wondered if she would be able to get around it without waking it up during the test. But when the ruler saw the strange map at Jodel's, he immediately said that it would lead him into a trap, because it was heading into a dangerous area. Too dangerous for the priests. The lady, saddened by something, said that she knew it very well, also saying that it was a gift from Theo. But the very next moment she took the card in her hand and smiled at the Holy King, with a blush on her face, telling him that that was why he had replaced Theo's card, something he did not yet suspect. Looking at Ulysses with a smile, the pink-haired lady said that she would definitely win against him because she immediately noticed something suspicious on his map, continuing to address himself as a guy. This also made the king smile, which made him look at the lady sweetly and think that it seemed that Jodel was already studying well and trying, and so he wanted to warn the heroine again about the beast that lived on the mountain. But the lady interrupted him, saying that she had just bought something from the monster with the money she had earned in the temple, and an hour later the main character was already walking along a steep mountain slope where there was a lot of vegetation, bushes, and trees, and at times she leaned forward, because the path was already difficult for her. Sometimes she clutched her head and kept thinking about the treasures, or rather, which one would be best for her to take with her in order to win, and whether saffron would be a good option for this. Looking at the mountain ahead of her, the girl remembered that there was a mine right above the lair, but getting precious stones from there was very risky, so she was not going to do it right away, because she knew that the monster reacted sharply to anyone who disturbed his peace. With these thoughts, the girl continued walking, thinking that fortunately, the monster seemed to be active only at night, and also that she needed to visit the saffron field if she wanted to get saffron there as a treasure. And a few minutes later, the main character had already come to a beautiful field of blue flowers, happy that she had found the very flowers that would help her in the fight against the beast if he woke up. She slowly collected each nice flower she liked into her bag, which she carried on her shoulder, thinking that for now everything was going well for her. And her excitement was not as strong as before, but everything was fine until the last moment, because the lady unsuccessfully raised her heel, caught on a stone and fell, rolling down on the grass, screaming in surprise and pain. As soon as she realized that she could easily wake up the monster with her noises, she froze, with a shocked look on her face, listening to the sounds of nature, trying to answer herself the question of where the beast was. The heroine's fear turned out to be stronger than anything, because she hurried down the mountain as quickly as possible, which is why, by sunset, she was already collapsing from fatigue on the ground in full view of everyone, while Kaio looked at her in shock. However, the students often looked at their watches with anxiety on their faces, realizing that there was very little time left before sunset, as one priest never returned back as planned. And while Jodel helped heal all the wounds with magic, some people counted the returning participants and looked at each one, while others looked at the area around, as if expecting someone to appear. Jodel knew very well that after sunset it became dangerous on the mountain, because then the wild, magical beast woke up. But when she sat on the grass, people walked around her and were clearly worried that Theo had not returned. But as soon as the lady realized that it seemed that Theo had not returned because of her fault, because she had given him a card with dangerous marks, just like he had, Jodel suddenly stood up from her seat, which surprised Hale. There were many thoughts in her head about how she was just paying him back in the same coin, getting revenge for the terrible treatment he had given her. But when she realized that Theo could die, she ran towards the mountain, stunning everyone present, while she hoped with anxiety on her face to find the guy and bring him back. The Holy King, who was sitting on the throne and watching everything from afar, also noticed this, but he couldn't help but watch as Jodel decided to sacrifice herself and the victory just to bring back Theo, who was probably in trouble. Without saying a word, he watched as the pink-haired girl, having made her choice, gradually disappeared from his sight and dissolved into the forest thicket. But the anxiety in his heart told him that something unexpected would happen. Meanwhile, the main character was already walking along the path, climbing the mountain. But above her head, there were still memories of the past, what Theo was like and how she disliked him, which is why she still considers him brainless if he decided to go up to the mine, thereby waking up the monster. But suddenly, the main character heard a guy's voice nearby, who was clearly shouting at someone to get away from him. And the protagonist turned her head in that direction because she instantly recognized Theo's voice. She immediately ran towards the sounds, hoping to save the guy as quickly as possible and shouting to him that the monster was sensitive to sounds, which is why his screams could only make the situation worse. And as soon as the heroine ran to the place, the first thing she noticed was a huge black wolf with red eyes and several heads, who was growling at Theo and was already preparing to eat him. And Theo himself continued to shout at the beast, holding something in his hands that looked like a pickaxe, which he swung, threatening the three-voiced wolf that he would defeat him with one blow, although no weapon was capable of stopping such a giant as the red-eyed wolf. Holding his weapon with both hands, Theo gradually retreated back in fear, but continued to shout at the wolf so that he would not come near him and not touch him. But it was useless, because with each step, the wolf was getting closer to him. The pink-haired lady realized that the beast would not leave him alone, so she decided to immediately put her hand in her bag in order to find that very bag, the thing she had bought with her own change a few days ago. Taking it out of her bag, the serious-minded girl began to doubt the fragrant saffron bag, which could distract a monster with its smell, asking herself whether she should also use magic on it. Having looked more closely at the plants around her, the girl realized that she could use magic to order them to emit a scent that was pleasant for the wolf. Because during all the time of her studies with the Holy King, she had mastered only this kind of basic magic. This is what the main character did, which is why the very next moment, when she was holding a bag of flowers in her hands, the lady recited a spell out loud, which is why the object in her hands began to shine with a blinding light. The wolf, who has several heads, immediately reacted to the pleasant smell that appeared, because his muzzle rose up and began to sniff, not intending to harm Theo. But Theo was so surprised by this that he continued to stand in place like a statue, looking at the wolf with real shock on his face, as if he did not believe that now the wolf was not trying to kill him, as before. He was even more surprised when the wolf began to walk somewhere to the side, with slow and relaxed steps, which made Theo ask himself why the beast suddenly calmed down and even stopped paying attention to her. But before the guy had time to look at the beast, the main character immediately grabbed him by the collar and dragged him along, forcing him to run, while the shocked Theo blushed and asked Jodel how she got here, what she was doing here. As they both ran through the forest, Jodel admitted that she had also ruined his map, just as he had ruined hers. But now she realizes that she had acted meanly, but she does not feel guilty because Theo had treated her much worse. Remembering that very beast that ominously looked at Theo with its red eyes, the girl asked him how he fell into her trap, because she thought that he would just come to admire the scenery or figure out her plans. But the girl, so happy about being saved, turned back, looked at Theo, and said that she was not at all the kind of person he thought she was. So they would talk about it when they got out of the forest and ran to the temple. Theo was so surprised by the girl's words and sincerity that he looked at her with an indescribable shock on his face, as if the real shock had only come now, when the one he hated with all his heart ended up helping him in his most difficult moment. Suddenly, pulling the lady by her clothes, Theo stopped her, saying that he had not yet found the precious stone, which was necessary to complete the task, and so he directly said that if he did not take it with him, all his efforts would be in vain. The pink-haired girl who looked like a boy protested, asking Theo how he could even think about that now when they had to immediately flee the forest to avoid being eaten by the monster. But Theo began to feel embarrassed, hanging his head down and not even looking the girl in the eyes out of shame, continuing to shout that everything was completely different from what she said. As soon as the boy shouted throughout the forest how he was going to pass the exam if he hadn't managed to take the precious stone, the madam looked up in shock, as if she had noticed something terrifying. The thing is that a three-headed beast emerged from the thicket of the forest and began not only to growl at the boys, not taking its red eyes off them, but also to run towards them with all its might, with a terrifying stomping of its paws and a roar. Only the roar and sudden appearance of the monster made the two boys run away from it with incredible force, while also shouting out in fear that the wolf has an incredibly terrible mouth and frightening heads. They both continued to run and did so at maximum speed, but the beast managed to catch up with them because its paw caught Theo's back, causing him to stagger and yelp in surprise when Jodel continued to run. The wolf continued to growl and show Jodel and Theo his terrible white fangs, when with his red, burning eyes he seemed to be able to frighten even the bravest and most courageous warriors. The boys did not look where they were running from the monster, and because of this, fear led them to a steep slope with thick, prickly bushes, from which the main character began to fall, receiving a variety of scratches due to the thickets. But what was her surprise when in a moment she realized that as if sacred magic instantly healed all the scratches on her body, because of which she herself began to glow, looking in surprise at the hand, which a couple of minutes ago was covered in wounds. The lady looked at her hand with wide eyes, noticing that it had become not only completely healthy, but also almost perfect, which is why she began to wonder what exactly had happened to it. As it turned out, it was at that moment that the Holy King felt with his body that the heroine had gotten into trouble and received injuries that appeared on his body as well, which is why he quickly healed them, also looking at his hand with a gloomy face. The pink-haired lady felt awkward, which was evident on her face as she tried to run, holding her bag with her hand and realizing that the Holy King was actually not as bad as she had previously thought. But the mighty beast did not slow down, because with each of its wide steps it approached the fleeing Theo and Jodel, intending to quickly eat them and take revenge for the disturbed peace. However, when the priests ran to the place unknown to them, they realized with horror that they were now at a dead end, at the very end of a cliff, from which it was impossible and very dangerous to descend. The pink-haired lady began searching through her bag for the remaining saffron flowers, telling Theo that they should use them to distract the monster and escape. But Theo seemed to only look back and was very worried. However, the girl realized that there was nothing else in her bag, which made her remember how quickly she ran from the monster with Theo and, it seems, dropped everything from it, which is why now she does not know how to fight off the beast. And while Theo, with horror on his face, was dying back and was preparing to meet his supposed death, the shocked lady turned around and with excitement on her face, suggested that it was necessary to use protective magic. They both watched as the three-headed beast ran towards them with all its might, growling, opening its mouth wider and wider, as if to grab them both with its teeth and swallow them. Jodel, realizing that this was the end, raised her hands up and seemed to be trying to defend herself from the beast's attack, closing her eyes and bending over in fear of dying. But what was her surprise when she realized that she did not feel any pain at all? Because when she opened her eyes, she saw in front of her a cute and seemingly obedient dog with 3 heads who had just licked the heroine's face. And while Theo could have fallen to the ground in fear, not even intending to get up, the pink-haired madam looked in shock at the monster who was tumbling cutely and smiling, showing his little wings. The girl started sneezing from an allergy to wool, but the wolf didn't care because he approached the protagonist and touched her face, which he was very happy about. And the girl was even more surprised by it. Jodel realized that since the wolf was not dangerous, she and Theo could safely go to the mine so that her friend could find his treasure. But when she was about to look at the guy, she noticed him lying on the ground in fear. And while the main characters were already establishing peace with the huge wolf, everyone present near the temple was worried, gathered in crowds, and did not understand how soon Jodel and Theo would return and whether they would return at all. One of the organizers of the evaluation, who was holding various papers in her hands, snapped at others and asked where the student Jodel had gone, since he had only just been here. Another lady with blue hair replied that she saw Jodel run back up the mountain, which greatly surprised the girl, asking her how he could do such a thing. Ulisses also thought about Jodel, who suddenly ran to save Theo, and remembered how the pink-haired lady ran, realizing that she was very close to victory, but gave it up in favor of saving another. So he smiled slyly, asking himself whether it was some small kindness that had made Jodel suddenly change her mind and run into the dangerous forest, where after sunset one could not only get lost, but also run into danger. But suddenly everyone noticed how 2 people were walking towards everyone in the distance, one of whom was clearly holding the other, which surprised those present, realizing that they were Jodel and Theo. And while everyone was surprised that Jodel had managed to save Theo, whom she was now carrying under her arm, everyone continued to look at her as she resolutely looked ahead and intended to quickly bring the frightened Theo to the priests. And Theo himself looked as if the last remnants of his soul were already leaving his body, which happened because of the fear he experienced at the moment of the beast's attack, although in fact it turned out not to be deadly at all. As soon as they returned, they, tired, immediately fell to the ground, and many priests began to crowd around them, surprised not only by the appearance of the main character, but also by the fact that she managed to save Theo. The shocked student was the first to decide to talk to them, which is why she asked about the flowers named saffron with a surprised expression on her face, as if asking Theo if he had used them for salvation. And she said this because in his hand the brunette was still clutching 2 saffron flowers, which looked like that very treasure, the most precious, brought straight from the mountain, which the boy considered the most valuable. The other priests, responsible for the organization and results of the competition, asked the main character, who was rising from the ground, what her treasure was then, if Theo was able to bring 2 flowers with him. And in her hands there was absolutely nothing. Looking at everyone, the lady admitted, playing the guy, that she did not think about the treasure at all, because she does not think that it does not have a certain shape and color, and others said that there is some logic in this. But when Jodel realized that her treasure would require too much space, she whistled and made the earth shake, causing Hallie, like everyone else, to become alarmed, thinking that an earthquake had begun. The earth continued to shake as if from loud, strong zags, which caused people to panic and run around. But Jodel remained calm, looking only at one point and already waiting for someone. Calling someone by the name of Barry, the pink-haired lady with short hair clearly and loudly ordered him to sit down when everyone else around was already preparing to save their lives from the loud noise. And the 3-headed wolf obeyed the girl, because he sat down on the ground in front of her with such a sweet smile, as if he was only happy to carry out orders from the protagonist, and as if he had not previously been considered a dangerous beast. While everyone looked at the girl in amazement and realized that she had managed to tame a huge wolf, which now obeyed her commands, Jodel herself stroked the animal's muzzle and told everyone with a smile that this was her treasure, which she had brought with her. And when even Theo was surprised by the skills of the main character, being next to a huge, cute wolf, the lady said that it was the beast that helped her and Theo get down from the cliff. And also, he will not harm anyone if you behave quietly and decently. The girl said that she also intended to go through the circle on the mountain, but Kyle, with red eyes, interrupted her, asking why she chose that particular mine and not others that were more accessible and safer. And the lady, showing everyone in her hand an unusual, glowing blue stone, said that all this was because of a mineral called creon, once again speaking to herself as a boy, in order to hide the fact that in fact she was a girl. Having imagined in her head the very mineral that she had known about earlier thanks to the plot of the novel, the heroine remembered that in this world everyone considers it useless, but they do not know its main property, amazing and mysterious. The fact is that right before the eyes of not only Kyle, but also of the others present, the stone began to glow, which is why the surprised elder asked if this was really the cryon that they had previously considered useless. The inspired lady presented the glowing mineral to her face and with a smile told everyone that if the stone was cleaned and left in the sun, it would absorb the light and allow it to illuminate everything around at night with its properties. Remembering the big and beautiful blue stone that could also emit light in the world, the lady realized that such stones were very expensive. And since there were a lot of cryon in the kingdom, it was easy to make money on it. She even imagined herself as a mother and child sitting next to the cryonics and going about their business, realizing that now light would be available to the poor, and they would not overpay for the expensive light from other stones. The red-eyed priest was very surprised by the knowledge of that student, who had previously only caused inconvenience to everyone and was a hooligan, so he exclaimed, barking at her, asking where she learned about all this. But the lady responded to this with a smile, saying that as a child she was very afraid of the dark, and it was with cryonics that her aunt gave her light so that she would not be so afraid. And also, holding it in her hand, she intended to tell about the purification of the mineral. And while the pink-haired lady was telling her research, the priest Hale looked at her with admiration and thoughtfulness, as if such a student as Jodel had every right to become the caretaker of the egg if she was able to tame the beast. But that was how she told everyone about the new cryonic technology. But suddenly Theo intervened in the conversation, telling everyone that there was a saffron field there, and near the monster's nest there was a hidden forest, which was located next to the hidden cliff that he remembered. The brunette with blue eyes and glasses sadly admitted that it was the student Jodel who told him about all these treasures and beauties, which is why the main character looked at him in surprise. The guy also confessed to everyone that before the evaluation began, he changed the Jodel card to trap him, which is why Theo remembered that very nightstand on which there was a card with red marks. Theo felt very ashamed when he remembered that, unnoticed by Jodel, he had taken her card and exchanged it for his own, incorrect one, while the heroine herself was busy with other things and did not see at all what her guest was doing. Even the Holy King himself rose from his throne to watch what was happening with folded hands, for he was amazed that such an interesting matter had come to an end by itself. And when Theo was told that for his crimes they intended not only to disqualify him from the temple, but also to expel him from the Palladium altogether, the sad brunette bowed his head, because he did not know what to answer from sadness. But he still said that he would accept his punishment, so he turned to Jodel, telling her that he was sorry with all his heart that this had happened and that he hated himself for bullying the heroine and tripping her up. His tired eyes clearly showed regret and pain, but he still looked at the heroine and thanked her for helping him even in the most difficult moments and when he was a real scoundrel. The boy's sincere words surprised the head Heaton so much that she began to look at him with genuine shock, quietly pronouncing his name, as if she really did not wish him harm and did not even intend to do him any harm in return. After some time, the chief judges, among whom was Kyle, gathered in a circle, discussing who should receive the podudk, because not only Theo had violated the rules of evaluation, but also Jodel, who had run into the forest in defiance of the ban. And when Kyle was thinking hard about how best to act here, so as not to remain heartless and, at the same time, evaluate everyone according to the rules, it was as if something flew into his forehead and bounced off. As soon as he angrily looked for the one who dared to throw a stone at him, he noticed with blindness that the holy egg had finally awakened and the sacred beast was born, showing everyone its white wings, cute paws, and eyes. And the first thing the sacred beast named Flo did after he was born was to stand menacingly in front of the main character, as if protecting her not only from the angry Kyle, but also from everyone who intended to harm her. While everyone was amazed at what was happening, the Holy King, who was sitting on the throne and saw everything perfectly, only smiled, saying that now everything was clear, because the Holy Beast himself chose Jodel as a caretaker and friend. The protagonist herself couldn't believe that her best friend had finally hatched from the nest and started flying in front of her and hugging, causing her to only gently touch him with her hands while the crowd around her watched in amazement. And she was very touched when the white little dragon bit her fingertip so weakly and playfully. And this made the lady laugh and be even more happy that she had such an incredible friend. She quickly realized that Flo couldn't speak yet, because he wasn't very grown up yet. So Madame decided to hug him tightly, laughing and rejoicing, while the dragon himself rejoiced even more. But everyone also noticed that the holy ruler suddenly stood up from his seat, which made everyone realize that right now they would hear the verdict of the entire evaluation from him personally, and so he would want to approach such a small miracle as floats. The girl with short hair and the small white dragon were already hugging each other sweetly, while the king slowly, step by step, approached them closer and closer, because he had been waiting for this moment for many days and weeks. The first thing Ulysses did was lean over to the heroine and ominously whispered why she, being a guy, was hugging a male dragon so warmly, not even suspecting that the heroine was actually a girl. But the king's suddenness quickly made the protagonist lean back from the long-haired Ulysses with squeals, holding Flo as if she wanted to save him from everyone, including the terrifying ruler. In response, he only laughed, asking the heroine why he was so terrified of him. If a couple of minutes ago she had hugged a dragon and, it seemed, was not afraid of anything. And while the king and the protagonist were arguing about what gender Flo was, since he had previously been in an egg, two friends not far from them were sighing and gasping because they couldn't get enough of such a rare miracle as a dragon, and a newborn one at that. Looking at the dragon's horns and appearance and how it was afraid of others while clinging to Jodel, everyone began to gossip that it was the heroine who awakened the sacred beast, which was even more surprising than the dragon's awakening itself. And the king himself was silent, clearly seeing before him that the dragon did not even want to look at him, but only wanted to press himself closer to Jodel's body, because he was afraid of everyone. The king did not like this turn of events, so he grabbed the dragon by the scruff of the neck and directed it towards his face with anger, because he was angry because the little creature really wanted to hug him, but not so much to get to know him. But the little boy himself was angry, which was evident from his frowning yellow eyes and the menacing pose he assumed then, and he let out several angry roars and exhalations, as if expressing his displeasure to the ruler. And this did not please the king even more, who began to look at the little dragon in exactly the same way, with disgust and anger on his face, because such a capricious creature for him did not intend to listen to him. However, when witnesses of the miracle looked at this picture from the side, they saw only that King Ulisses was very gently touching the dragon's cheek with his hand, and he was only happy about it, although in reality everything was completely different. Because in reality, the long-haired man was holding the holy beast by the scruff of the neck so that everything around him seemed to be ablaze with his anger, but he himself was smiling, telling Flo that he had the same unpleasant, capricious character. The dragon continued to flounder, which is why he couldn't even free himself, while Ulysses ordered him to speak to him in human language, otherwise he wouldn't let him go. And this horrified the main character, whose face turned pale from such cruelty. Noticing that her best friend had started to cry, the girl stretched out her arms to him and told him to fly straight to her so that she could quickly pity him and hug him. This is what the little beast wanted to do, which is why he quickly struck the king's cheek with his paw, forcing him to let go and thereby punishing him for his unacceptable attitude towards himself. And Ulysses could only watch as a crying, cub-like animal flew up to the main character, which he immediately intended to pick up. But at that time, Ulysses did not understand why he felt bad if he simply saw how the guy was supposedly hugging the animal. At that moment, a brilliant idea came into his head, which made a light bulb shine above his head, because he figured out how to start a conversation with the protagonist on the topic he needed. He began to approach Jodel with slow but confident steps, telling her that he was certainly glad that she had now become the beast's caretaker. But the girl moved even further away from him. And he even smiled, telling the lady that he was glad of this for the reason that now her place of residence passed into his direct power. While the main character was at a loss for words to express her shock, Ulysses remembered how she smiled while behind bars when the guy told her that she would move to the main wing if she The pink-haired girl stood there with her mouth open and silent from defeat, holding Flo in her arms, while the holy king was next to her and calmly said that even the holy beast himself would not mind being with her, which meant that everything was. When the ruler said that if the sacred beast had chosen her, then she should look after him and be close by, the intimidated lady, looking at Ulysses with a feigned smile, asked what would happen now. And the holy king, smiling, told the girl that he was now giving her a whole building in the main wing so that only she could be there with him, as well as the holy animal, so that no one else would interfere. Having also heard that she would be studying there on the side, conducting research, and always, while things were only getting better in the state of Palladium, because the appearance of the holy little animal had lifted everyone's spirits, in the empire of Brickholt, where the ominous gray-blue palace was located, because the furious emperor had already shouted at someone, asking his servant why in another state where the holy animal was born, and they still have no one, which is why the man with the mustache goes into a addressing the subordinate before him as Duke Jovahilda. The emperor sat relaxed on the throne and ordered the man to immediately The duke himself, it seems, did not even try to look at the emperor out of fear, but only kept his head down, not knowing how to answer the supreme ruler if he himself did not know the solution to this mystery. Sweat slowly dripped from his face and fell onto the dark carpet as Duke Jovahilda trembled with fear and stuttered as he tried to utter his first. Having imagined in his head a clawed little animal that had hatched from an egg, the emperor began to shout again, explaining to the duke. And when the emperor shouted that he was talking about a boy named Jodel, who was the child of Duke Jovahild, the brunette with despair on his face became even more frightened. The emperor ordered the duke to immediately find out everything that had happened while the sun was shining in the palladium, and it was a clear day. And also a lady with a company was walking in the garden, and everyone present was very surprised that this time the girl was not just sweeping, but was doing it with the company of a cheerful and playful nesting animal, which was flying around her and sitting on her. Having imagined a well-read and experienced priest in her head, the girl remembered that she had recently been promoted to the status of a high-ranking priest, which in importance was second only to the high priest in the high. But most of all, she was happy with Flo, with whom she now talked for a very long time, but now asked to take his paws off. So the girl was amused and pleased that she was able to take first place in the competition without the efforts of the holy animal, for which that's why she now smiles sweetly at Flo and hugs him whenever she gets the chance, knowing that she has earned the right to be with him as a treasured friend. Sometimes she looked at the pink rosebuds in the garden, which blossomed and only became better almost exactly like the main character in her achievements. But still, the girl had something that bothered her. The thing is, she was still playing in her head the smile and the kind voice of the king, with which he informed her that she would now be in the central wing, although previously even studying in the temple was a fairy tale for her. The heroine was worried about the fact that her new place of residence was precisely of colossal size. Sometimes the lady could not stop looking at the beautiful table in the garden, on which stood red roses in a vase, because the whole garden was filled with them. Like the most heavenly, the lady was even more surprised by the fact that she had received an entire 3-story building for herself, in which she would now live alone, in which she now stared at. However, she imagined the mysterious Ulisses in time, who raises his index finger to his lips. This is what made the lady nervous, looking at her new home with a wary expression on her face, with Flo on her shoulder, because she knows that this is not the end of all the trials, but only gets more complicated. And her mood was always lifted by a white bundle of happiness called Floats, who smiled, made cute sounds, and had fun with the heroine, which made her enjoy life and also thank Flo for being born and choosing her as a friend. But the lady was not completely alone because she began to be pursued more often by paparazzi, who were still hiding in the bushes, where the girl ordered the servants with cameras to photograph the heroine as quickly as possible, while he was sweetly making contact with the beast. She yelled at her servants when they were afraid of Jodel, because they thought that she was still the guy who was rude to everyone and was boorish, and the brunette ordered everyone to immediately take pictures of her with Flo, so that and the lady always made the decision to run away from the paparazzi with Flo on her shoulder, pretending to laugh, when in fact she really didn't want to attract attention to herself and be famous, which is what she was doing now, holding a broom in her hand. However, suddenly there was a girl with blonde hair in front of her, because of which her face was not visible, but her cheeks were red, because she was clearly going to ask the protagonist with an unusual request. The girl, without further ado, handed Jodel a note, doing it so abruptly and embarrassedly that she could have died of shame. And as soon as the lady looked at what she received from the girl, the pink-haired heroine's face showed genuine shock, and her jaw seemed to drop by itself, because before that she had never received a confession of love. When the blonde had already disappeared, running away so quickly that Jodel didn't have time to say anything, the lady looked at the note with astonishment, even dropping her broom on the floor, because she realized that it was a note with a confession. She began to scratch her neck in embarrassment, looking at the envelope with the heart, realizing that for the first time she received. However, the main character was even more amazed when the blue butterfly not only flew up to her and sat on her shoulder, but spoke in a human voice. Or rather, the voice. And after some time, the heroine was already in front of the Holy King, bowing to him and holding her hand on her chest, telling him that if he wanted to call her, it would. Indifferent to the fear, Ulysses replied that he didn't want it, and he was already examining and reading the documents in his hands, not even looking at the main character who had come to him. The girl asked the king why he had called her to his office. The long-haired ruler asked in response if any request was needed for this, but this only angered the pink-haired beauty. But he still looked kindly at the lady, as if it was just a joke, but in fact he wanted to see the protagonist, and that's why he smiled sweetly, imperceptibly. Putting his hands on the table, the guy asked the Garen if she liked the new home, to which he replied that she still couldn't believe what was happening, because she thought she was in a. However, when the ruler asked the heroine if she wanted to take a servant, it was quite logical to do so if she now lived in the highest-ranking wing, but this made the lady fall silent in surprise. She was already imagining Rosalia tumbling across the huge floor, until Ulysses explained that this temple was very large in size. The frightened girl replied that everything was fine and she did not need servants, because in fact she was very afraid that someone would find out that she was not a brat. But the ruler closed his eyes and said that he had two pieces of news. Smiling sweetly at the girl and leaning forward towards her, he said that one of them was bad and the other was good. So he asked her which news to start with. The wary madame also smiled, telling the king that she most likely wanted to be the first to hear the good news, already afraid to hear something from such a serious person as Ulysses. The ruler said that he knew that he had received his first letter of love, and he congratulated the student on it. But the pink-haired lady was very surprised by this. So Jodel calmed down, realizing that it was just the king's tricks. But when he said that he would tell her the really good news, after he informed Ellie that her parents really missed her, the protagonist was surprised, asking if that was true. The thought of her birth parents made the girl briefly imagine them in her head, asking herself if she would really meet them someday, even if they weren't described in the book. In a beautiful white office with very high ceilings, Ulysses sat at his desk in front of a standing girl and said that now he wanted to tell her the bad news. And when the unknown couple in the Palladium was already in front of the high doors, Ulysses seriously told Jodel that her parents had already arrived at the temple to see her. After some time, the main character, who herself did not know what to expect, came to her parents, who were in the living room, near the blue furniture, meeting their child, whom they had not seen for a very long time. The pink-haired lady stood there looking away, embarrassed, wondering what kind of parents she had in this world. But even they thought she was a boy, not suspecting that in fact this was not the case at all. The blonde in the crimson dress and the girl's father, Duke Jovohilda, looked at his daughter with a smile, but addressed her as a son, asking if he had missed them all this time. The Duke's wife also smiled, telling Jodel that they had not seen each other for a long time, and the heroine had not even written them letters, which was why they were very bored and upset. The lady was happy with her parents' words and even blushed a little, because she didn't even believe that she could have loved ones who would miss her and worry about her. So the first thing she did was smile slightly at them. Sometimes glancing at the lamp with candles on the nightstand, the girl found it a little strange that she had parents whom she had not heard of before, but still wanted to be closer to them. And she thought so for the reason that in her past life she couldn't even dream of loving parents, which is why she only looked at the families who joyfully and happily passed by her when she was little. But the lady was pulled out of her dreams by the blonde suddenly, and in a rough voice saying that a good child would not have kept them waiting. So they ordered her to show them the sacred beast as soon as possible, which stunned the lady. Swinging her long golden hair over her shoulders, the woman said once again that it was only for this little animal that they had come such a long way. So the pink-haired lady said in an upset voice that she thought they had come here for her. But the blonde replied that they would not fulfill the expectations of some priest, because looking intently at the heroine with her empty and angry black eyes, the woman said that all good and well-mannered children should act this way. So she asks Jodel again where the beast is. Suddenly feeling that the heroine's heart was beating very fast, the lady decided to go to the door and explain to the parents that she could not take them to the animal because she did not have the right to do so, and they did not have the right either. But the blonde still looked at her son with disdain, telling him the Duke looked at Jodel with exactly the same condemnation, telling his son that the sacred beast, like the ore, the saffron field, were all his merits, and they knew this very well. But they were angry that their son dedicated all this to the Palladium. But at that moment, the heroine remembered how Jodel was still very little, and it dawned on the girl when suddenly everything around her became dark and terribly cold. When from the memories of the past Jodel she realized that she had come to the Palladium not of her own free will, but because of her parents. Remembering how Jovahilda's family was depicted in the book, Jodel realized that her mother and father she and the imperial family wanted to destroy the Palladium, but in Italy they themselves were executed by the guillotine, which the lady imagined in her head. And she did not expect at all that because of her silence she would receive a blow to the cheek, which instantly made her cheek turn red, because the blow of the hand was not weak, but with a loud slap that echoed throughout the room. She was hit by her father, who continued to shout, asking his son why he was flying in the clouds and not telling them anything. And while the shocked and frozen with fear girl touched her reddened cheek with her hand, from which a drop of blood was slowly flowing, because there was a small cut there, Dad continued to shout at her. The protagonist remembered the first time she cried in front of Ulisses, when her father screamed in front of her, telling her that they sent her here so that she could find the weakest points of the Palladium. The pink-haired lady looked down devastatedly and covered the wound on her face with her hand as her dad yelled at her, saying that his job as a son was to distract everyone from Garum, but in the end, he was the one who sentenced him to death. Then the girl remembered that the first time she went to prison was because of the attack on Ulisses, and she did it on purpose so that Garum would order everyone behind her back to sell the name of the temple and take money from him, to steal it. Father clenched his fist once more, shouting at Jodel and telling her that she was just a replacement for Seidel. But the lady did not look at him because of the emptiness inside and the despair. And when the girl tried to remember who Seidel was, whom she, on the orders of her father, had to portray, she remembered how the past Jodel, when she was little, She remembered not only that the boy was her twin, but she also remembered that fateful day when he led her to an unknown door, showing her his index. And they opened the door a little and saw how in a dark room their parents were engaged in forbidden magic, from which the whole darkness was illuminated by. But something went wrong at that moment, causing the magic to become not just uncontrollable, but unusually strong and powerful, causing an explosion to thunder in the dark room, and everything to glow with a. The magic was about to sneak up on the children, who had only slightly opened the door, but Seidel covered the pink-haired girl with himself in time while she looked at what was happening in surprise. And when the boy tragically died, protecting his sister, the heroine at that moment saw her mother, who began to touch her daughter and scream that if it weren't for her, this wouldn't have happened. It was after this moment that the parents ordered the servants not only to tie up Jodel, but also to transform her into a boy. Remembering how the girl found herself in a dark cell with her hands tied again, she realized that even at that moment, the girl covered her face, realizing that the previous Jodel had been very lonely and scared, because even her parents had turned away from. But now the Duke was just clutching his head, saying that if their son had now received a high post, he would be able to play the role of Jaram. That is, the blonde began to slowly approach Jodel, saying that even without a last name, he was still their But as soon as she heard that Jodel, in response to all their demands, whispered that he would not do it, the girl's mother was surprised and began resolutely raising her head and looking at her parents. The lady said that she refused everything they offered her, doing it as loudly and clearly as possible. Little did she know that the Holy King quickly learned of her troubles through the connection between their bodies, because a scratch similar to hers appeared on his cheek, which made him realize that Jodel was being bullied. Imagining a black, bony palm in her head, the girl remembered that her family possessed forbidden magic, with the help of which one could control a soul, or even reproduce someone's life. And also, imagining the sacred beast that had already succumbed to black magic, the lady realized that if her family were to obtain the beast, she would definitely absorb her magic into it. The Duke, the father of the pro at Granitsky, understood this perfectly. The angry girl looked angrily at her parents and explained to them that she had let them down several times already, and therefore it would not be surprising if in the future everything would not go the way they wanted, and they had to. And when the lady asked her parents to throw her out of the Jovahilda family, the girl's father became even more angry, furiously saying that it seemed that all the time they had not seen. He continued to shout, telling Jodel that he was not some kind of priest, but a member of the Jovahilda family, who must carry out the orders of his parents, and he was also going to swing, which is why he was already raising his hand up. But the pink-haired lady showed them 3 fingers, calmly telling them that there were 3 continents in this world, specifying that Brickald was on the ground, while the other, on the contrary, was in the... She imagined it in her head, telling that Palladium is exactly the continent that is in the air. And as soon as she said that she would never sink to the very bottom, because she was even higher than the Empire, the father swung his arm. The girl instinctively covered her body with her hands, also turning away from her dad, because she was already preparing to take a strong blow from him with her hand, because she had nowhere else to run. However, the father never did this, because he was surprised that the wound on the lady's cheek suddenly disappeared somewhere, which is why he asked his daughter where she went and why there was no more scratch on her, which surprised the lady, looking at herself and realizing that, most likely, as soon as she thought about the ruler, the door that the girl had leaned against earlier opened, causing the lady to fall to the floor, screaming in fear and trying to grab something with her hands. However, even at this moment, she was saved by the long-haired king, who opened the door, who held the girl by the waist and looked into her eyes when she looked at him in surprise and grief. The first thing the king did was smile at Jodel's parents, asking Duke Jovahild if he understood the whole situation correctly. The blonde and the duke were surprised by the appearance of the ruler of the state and moved away from him in shock, not intending to say anything yet, because they found themselves in a very awkward situation where it seemed the king heard them yelling at Jodel. The king continued to sweetly delve into the matter, telling the protagonist's parents that he was just thinking about having a chat with the dear guests who had arrived from the Empire. When Jodel realized that the ruler was seriously angry, because it seemed he also felt how much his cheek hurt, the heroine's parents bowed low to the ruler without saying a word. Ulysses and Jodel stood and looked at the protagonist's parents when, in dead silence, the king angrily and loudly asked the duke if it was true that he had hit his child earlier. Bowing his head forward in respect, the duke did not know what to answer, which is why he looked away, understanding only that if he had known that everything would turn out like this, he would have wanted to make peace with Jodel rather than beat her. And the heroine's mother answered the question, also bowing to the king and replying that there was simply a misunderstanding between them. But her hand shook as she continued to say that they were both forced to raise their voices at the child for educational purposes, and that the king had actually misunderstood everything, although he had already realized. However, they both raised their heads when the ruler sternly ordered them to do so, and also when the duke asked the king to give them permission to take his child home to rest a little. But this too turned out to be a lie. After this, Ulysses took the protagonist's hand and raised it, immediately explaining that he is not a parent to Jodel at all, but will still do what he wants. Having shown everyone, including the parents, that there were drops of blood on Jodel's palm, the king said that although the duke also clearly noticed the traces of blood and became even more agitated, the king also suddenly touched Jodel's cheek, causing the girl to flinch momentarily. But the calm man said that he understood. The girl looked into the king's eyes with surprised eyes and seemed to freeze in place when he touched her cheek and short hair with his fingers. And the ruler himself smiled sweetly, also looking the girl in the face, as if now something in his soul blossomed and trembled when he saw. And while the lady was still surprised, touching herself in the place where Ulysses had touched, the gentleman smiled at the heroine's parents and said that he had many reasons to protect Jodel as a priest and a valuable student, which is what he now wanted. He looked at the Duke and his wife with his blue eyes, explaining that all the priests in this temple belonged to him, and no one had the right to beat them, much less raise a hand against them. Meanwhile, the lady remained silent, looking fearfully at her parents, when the stern but smiling Coral asked the Duke whether he had insulted. Realizing that with one order the king could ruin his life forever, the Duke shouted that he had no intention of harming his son, but simply wanted to teach him a lesson. But the ruler was not going to believe. But when the king shouted out that this was not at all how he had imagined imperial education, which turned out to be even wild, and the blonde and the Duke fell silent when they realized that now, because of the king's anger, they could inadvertently create a conflict not only between the two. The king, whose face the villain still had in the shadows when he smiled, once again told the heroine's parents that the status of a priest meant that a person was his property, and in Jodel's case, he was also entrusted. And when the king asked if Jodel's parents understood this, the girl's mother grabbed her hands and fearfully answered that everything was so, because they clearly understood everything, asking the ruler to believe them. The parents continued to stand in front of Ulysses and Jodel as the long-haired man explained that when they came to the Palladium uninvited, he tried to understand them because they were. When the king began to threaten his parents in a rough voice that he would consider the attempts on Jodel's life as a mockery of the Palladium by the With his eyes closed, Ulysses also told Jodel's parents that they had treated him disrespectfully as well, which is why he now had the right to sentence them to death if he saw fit. It was at this moment that the blonde and the Duke fell silent, began to tremble with excitement, not even intending to say that everything was wrong, because it was useless. But imagining a statue of the goddess of mercy in her head, Ulysses said that their country relies on mercy and kindness in politics, and therefore here he does not want to create unnecessary conflict. And the Duke was very surprised by this, which is why he looked at the holy ruler in surprise when he was already preparing to meet his death or serve a life sentence in prison. Putting his hand on his chest, the king, smiling and with his eyes closed, said in a sweet voice that since this was a family conflict, the petition should also take. After he said such a strange phrase, the king quietly pushed Jodel, who was standing next to him, with his hand, which made the lady look at him in surprise, pointing his finger at the girl's feet to the protagonist's parents, meaning the floor next to them. The king silently ordered the Duke and his wife to bow to Jodel personally, thereby asking for forgiveness for the bullying. Understanding this, the Duke trembled again and even blushed, looking with horror at his son's feet and realizing that the ruler was ordering them not only to bow, but also to. Smiling ominously, the sweet and smiling king, who understood everything before, told the heroine's parents not to miss their chance while they can still use it, can stand on their feet and have freedom, which he can take away from them with the snap of a finger. Sometime after this, the main character intended to catch up with the gentleman when he himself was walking in the garden near the Temple of Rosalia, when by this time it was already dark, and everything around was illuminated only by bright moon. The king spoke to Jodel first, asking if Jodel was sure that their forgiveness was sincere, to which the pink-haired heroine, playing the role of the boy, replied that they even turned pale, because of which she became afraid for them. At that moment, the heroine remembered how her parents nevertheless bowed to her, knelt before her and the king, when their faces only became paler out of fear of receiving the most severe punishment from the sender. Turning to the girl from behind, the long-haired guy said that he really wanted the Duke to hear her words, because he was sure that from such a thing his pride would shatter into the smallest pieces. They both stopped in the evening haze when the short-haired lady asked Ulysses how long he had been in the hall, fearing that the gentleman could have heard the entire conversation with his parents, including the discussion of the plan with Garum, and most importantly, and when Ulysses replied that he had heard everything since Jodel had told them about the difference between the continents, the lady imagined a closed door, because she remembered that her parents were now forever forbidden to visit. The lady thought that because of this order, she now definitely had no way to get back home. And the ruler, who seemed to have heard the heroine's thought, the girl immediately perked up, looked at the king with big eyes, and said that she was not in pain at all, although she still fleetingly thought about her home and seemed sad about it. And when the man came closer to her, causing her to look into his eyes with her beautiful pink eyes, he said that he had heard that wounds on the face were very painful, but they became even more painful when they're coming closer to her. The tall, long-haired guy asked the lady again if she was upset, to which the girl quietly replied that she was not, speaking about herself as a guy. And with a light movement of his fingers, the king forced the lady's chin to be raised and thus to look at him, telling her that for him the student Jodel should have no secrets, which he said in a relaxed voice. Holding his hand near the heroine's face, Ulysses leaned even closer to the lady, saying that he must ask his student again if he was upset and sad. The pink-haired lady did not answer right away, because she blushed deeply and became embarrassed. But her silence gave the gentleman a reason to worry, which she understood perfectly well. She realized that she was deceiving herself when she told the king that she did not feel sad at all about the loss of her parents. And she also realized that if they were... The king asked the student why he wanted to ask him to pretend that nothing had happened. He said that he did so because he did not want Jodel to be in his room again. But looking at her master with tear-stained eyes, the girl asked the king what if for her to remain silent and cry in the room was the best option, if she was a weak person. But suddenly the king smiled at the girl, telling her that she was a real fine girl and there was no need to cry, because by the time she came of age, she had already achieved what many could only dream of at their age. This greatly surprised the main character, which is why she looked at Ulysses with her mouth open, but still accepted his compliments, which made her stop crying for a moment. The lady wiped away the remains of her tears with her palms, asking the king what news he had prepared for her, because earlier Ulysses had apologized to her for calling her parents' arrival good news. Without saying a word, the boy leaned over to the girl and pinned something to her clothes with his hands, while the Jodel looked at him in surprise with big, pink eyes. Looking at her robe, the lady noticed a gray round and small badge on it, which made her amazed, realizing that thanks to it, she had now become a high-ranking priest in the Palladium. The Holy King formally congratulated her on joining the Great Temple, where she became a full priest. And as he spoke his words, the blue-eyed man looked at Jodel and explained that when entering the temple officially, a priest must forget about his lineage. So now he looks at her and asks if she is a descendant. Sharply clenching her hand into a fist, the girl replied with fury on her face that of course now nothing connected her with her family anymore. After that, the king told the heroine in a gentle voice to prove in the future that her faith in the temple is not false. And he also carefully covered the lady. And while the lady couldn't figure out the cloth on her head that covered her hole, the ruler said that entry here was prohibited. So he covered her just in case, also warning that she would need to try harder if she became an official priest. But even the king's cape didn't help him hide Jodel, because the two guys in the tree were watching them the whole time. And the brunette cheerfully said that the pink-haired guy was the one. His blue-eyed, blonde-haired friend calmly told him to keep his voice down and not to whistle in the tree because they might exhaust themselves and attract attention, which was unacceptable in their case. The dark-haired friend only smiled, saying that he had a habit of whistling everywhere and all. He continued to sit on the tree, asking the blonde if the rumors were true about the pink-haired guy being the ruler's mate and not just a student. They both laughed as they explained that a king's mate was always his life partner, which made it much more interesting for both of them to watch from the sideline. However, at the moment when the holy ruler was talking to Jodel in the night garden and giving the token, and this witness was so shocked that his hands weakened, because of which he was unable to hold on to all the books that he had previously had to take somewhere, and because of which they fell with a crash onto the stone floor. That person turned out to be the priest Hale, who had been watching the couple from afar and was still in shock, causing it. The next day, all the chief priests of the temple were in a large, luxurious, and snow-white visit with columns and ornaments, because a meeting was beginning. All the main followers of the Holy King and he himself were sitting at a round table and were already discussing something, while Ulysses sat calmly on a chair, and it seemed that Kyle was the one thinking the most at the meeting, because there seemed to be a dark aura over his head as he worried about whether to accept Ulysses' strange love or to oppose it. He tried to use the leaves of the yellow flower to tell whether the Holy King would love Mr. Jodel, So he gradually tore off the small leaves and hoped that the outcome would please him. Kale was already imagining in his head how the Holy King would smile and hug Jodel, which would make her smile, which would make them look like a real couple who loved each other. And when he realized that there was one leaf left on the flower, meaning that the Holy King still loved Jodel, Hale stopped, holding out his trembling palm to the petal, as if this was shocking news. One employee began to loudly say that today's topic of conversation was the exchange of minerals from the mountain range, but she was unable to finish because Kale screamed in horror. He sat at the table and was very frightened when everyone made a remark to him, hinting to be quieter, and the old man apologized. Although what really horrified him was Hale looked at the last yellow petal and remembered that recently the Holy King really treated Jodel's student very reverently, even bestowing his attention on him quite often. Even now, when he looked at the holy ruler, when he spoke, he saw bruises with nail marks on his hands, which frightened him incredibly. Looking at the table with his red eyes, the priest remembered that very explosion in the temple, when they did not understand anything. But now he reported that it happened because the Holy King linked. This is why he imagined the pink-haired student Jodel holding hands with Ulisses as a magical symbol formed between them, signifying that they were now inseparable and connected by life itself. The girl with short brown hair continued to talk to the group about the transportation of goods. Taking advantage of the moment, Haile rose from his seat and asked the holy ruler his question regarding whether he wished to find marriage. But Ulysses interrupted him, smilingly saying that he would never marry anyone. When the king said that he would not even have offspring, Kail was horrified, looking at him with his red eyes in amazement and asking how this could be, if he was the only possessor of the sacred power that must be passed on to descendants. To this, the king replied smilingly that he was already married to Palladium himself, after which he folded his hands and began to smile, as if he looked away from the excitement, began to think about the fact that it seemed that the king clearly wanted to divert suspicion from himself. If he spoke in unclear phrases, this made him even more suspicious that all his guesses would turn out to be true. And when the meeting in the beautiful, large, and snow-white temple with the blue roof came to an end, Kail still wondered whether the disciple Jodel was really so important to the Holy King that he preferred to lie even to his most faithful. When all of Kail's thoughts were only getting worse and worse every day, the king himself was sitting at his desk in his office, his hands folded, as if he didn't even want to look at the person standing in front of him. The thing is that every hour the priest Hale began to increasingly pressure the Holy King with his marriage proposals, which is why now he will be in front of him, constantly showing his finger up and saying that. But it seemed that the king did not even listen to him, because with his eyes closed, he turned to his hand. In fact, the ruler, imagining in his head beautiful deities, a girl and a boy who stretch out their hands to each other, knows that he is a descendant. He presented not only the silhouettes of the bride and groom in their outfits, but also the broken glass between them, realizing that people who marry for a specific purpose are often unhappy. But what scared him even more was that if such a couple had a baby, it would be just as faceless and seemingly empty, because it was born not out of love, but out of obligation. That's why he sadly, and as if from irritation, tilted his head to the side, thinking that all this was literally meaningless and stupid, because he didn't want to. Even when Jodel appeared in front of him, who was shocked that the gentleman in front of her was sitting at the desk in a very bad mood, her face even turned blue because the king in front of her was sad. So she began to guess that she had done something wrong, and because of this, she remembered how she had recently done something that might be causing. And when the girl admitted that it was she who ate one of the mints in the king's office, Ulysses looked at her with puzzlement, asking again about what she had just said. The lady showed the ruler 2 fingers, saying that in plain English she had eaten 2 of his mints, for which she was very sorry. But the shocked Ulysses only looked at her and understood that this was not the reason for his sadness. He smiled as he told the lady that these were not ordinary mints, but crystals that could restore stamina. And as for the fact that his student ate a couple of such crystals, he should not worry, since he would soon replenish their supply. However, the man's mood quickly changed, because he saw bruises on Jodel's wrist identical to the bruises on his hand, which led him to immediately assume that the wounds were caused by excavations on the mountain ridge. Noticing that the king was looking at him with an angry look, the girl began to feel embarrassed and afraid of him, with a feigned smile asking what was wrong and what she had done wrong this time. The long-haired man sitting at the desk informed the heroine that since she was constantly getting into trouble and hurting herself, he decided to assign certain people to her. The surprised lady turned around as the man ordered someone to enter the office, and her jaw dropped at the sight of those behind her. Seeing the strange people, she immediately remembered the knights who were also in the temple, namely in the northern wing, who were responsible for the country's fighting power. Its strength. Looking at the two guys who were walking towards her with blue knightly uniforms, she understood that due to different types of activities, priests and knights rarely meet. But now she sees an exception in front. As soon as Ulysses said that these two guys would now guard Jodel's student everywhere, the girl was horrified and very surprised, asking the king if this was really so. Telling the main character that his name was Wisterun, the brunette with tan skin smiled at the main character. Also named Lajos was his friend with golden hair and blue eyes, who bowed his head down in greeting and said that the pink-haired Lely looked at the boys with fear and shock as they pushed each other and played around, realizing that they were second only to Ulysses' personal army in terms of authority. But suddenly, the main character noticed that one of the knights grabbed her hand with his hand, and because of surprise, she did not immediately touch the knight's hand, because she did not know what he intended to do. However, it turned out that the blonde guy with blue eyes was quite serious about kneeling down in front of the lady and kissing her hand, even if everyone thought she was a guy, which made Jodel freeze in place in shock. She screamed in shock, flinching on the spot, causing her to ask the gentleman with emotions of incredible shock what he was doing, as the knight increasingly put the lady in an awkward position. Lajos just looked at her and explained that it was the most ordinary knightly oath when he promises with a kiss on the hand to always be there and protect. But this did not calm the girl down, so she quickly removed her hand. The lady touched her hand as if it could just be bitten off and looked at the knight with an equally indignant expression, realizing that she was uneasy about such oaths because the fear that the knight. Even after some time, when the lady met the knights and began to go about her business, all the priests looked at her with surprise, because they saw not only her, but also two warriors. The girl tried to hide from them with a quick step, because they literally followed her everywhere and watched her every step, and Lajos and Wisteron still followed her, which is why others looked at them. The blonde guy behind even warned the lead heroine about the cracked tile she might step on next, but the pink-haired lady blushed from the constant attention, quietly thanking her guards for their. She began to walk at a very fast pace, as if she was already crying from despair. But she still smiled, telling herself that she could not live like this any longer, because this was real mockery from the king. Imagining how they were next to her almost around the clock, the lady realized that they were like her shadow, always nearby and never disappearing, doing their job too well. Even when she was in bed and getting ready for sleep, they seemed to be drilling her with their gaze and guarding her even in the bedroom until they completely convinced themselves that the lady was not in. In those moments when they noticed the sadness of the main character about the fact that they were always following her, but her head was occupied not only with thoughts about the guards who were pestering her, because now she opened one door and decided to look into the room where her friend Flo lived, however, the little white dragon didn't even look at her, because he buried his face in the back of the chair and waved his tail in displeasure, as if something didn't suit him, or he was offended. She decided to kneel down in front of him and told him with a smile that she was busy exploring the mountain range and therefore could not visit him often. But the animal had no intention of turning towards her, and only growled discontentedly. The girl knew how to cheer up Flo because she pulled out a fresh sprig of mint from her pocket, which the little dragon loves so much, smilingly telling her best friend that she brought it especially for him. However, the monster did not want to turn to her, because he folded his paws and began to sigh with displeasure, while the naively adoring girl understood that it was not so easy to cheer up the little animal. But when the girl began to sadly tell him that because of this they would never be able to go to the birthday party together, the monster's ears became pointed and twitched as he caught the important information. To make it more believable, the protagonist even cried, sadly telling that they probably would never be able to be together, even if she loved him very much. So she was forced to say goodbye to him, and only these words made the little sacred animal understand that he loved Jodel incredibly and did not want to part with her. Because he blushed and began waving his arms vigorously, raising them up with cute sounds as if trying to persuade the protagonist not to leave him, because he loved her more than anyone in this world. The girl only had to stretch out her arms for the little beast to rush to her for a hug when tears were already dripping from his eyes, and the pink-haired lady was apologizing for hurting him and Flo began to hug his beloved Jodel tightly, clinging to her more and wanting to cry, at the same time calming down, because the lady had not left him. The fact is that the birthday party is needed just for the sacred beast with wings, horns, and cute paws, which is a very rare. Because of this, the lady imagined the temple in which she lives, realizing that its task is to show the whole country the sacred beast. Therefore, the priests were already preparing for the holiday as much as possible, setting up chairs and checking all the rooms and what the girl was watching, because the main character examined everything in the interior. And she also walked in her friend's arms because it was important for her to check all the passages with structures so that Flo would not get hurt or get lost here. But she was not alone at this moment, because she was quickly joined by two knights, Laios and Wisteron, who stood behind her, which made the lady feel shy and stop being more open. And she was even more horrified when the brunette with tanned skin pulled out a lizard from somewhere, which he began to hold by the tail and show to the heroine with a smile, which stunned. But that was not all, for he also took out of his pocket a frog, which he showed in his palm. For his antics, Whisperon quickly received a blow to the head, which caused a bump to appear on the top of his head. And it was the blonde who hit him, who said that with a bump on his head, but still smiling at the main character, Wisteron asked her how she found out about the mineral cryon. Because the lady, talking to herself as a guy in order not to give away her true gender, said that she had simply been reading a lot of books. Remembering what the cryon itself looked like, the brunette began to say that he, being a native of his lands, saw how this mineral was often used in his. The girl was surprised, looking at Wister with the same emotions and asking him what he meant when he talked about his native land. Remembering how beautiful the fields in his country were, which had no paint, were decorated with blue skies and blue flowers, Wister told the region that he was from a continent called Media. He even put his hand on the shoulders of his blonde friend, with whom he constantly spends time, telling the lady with a smile that they were both from that continent, and he was even surprised, asking if he had told her this before. The red-eyed beauty was even more amazed and looked at the guys as if she had already begun to draw some pictures in her mind, because she knows about the Media continent thanks to the novel that she read in her past life. Having imagined a snow-white flying fairy in her head, she remembered that it was there that earthly spirits with summoning animals lived, because this place was the product of magic on Earth, considered a beautiful, enchanting place. But she also remembered the mysterious tunnel, realizing that this wonderful place not only has majestic beauty and nature, but also has numerous secrets scattered throughout the continent. Having started to think about the endless gold coins, the girl with Flo in her hands remembered that, as a state, Media has many jewels, and in politics it is neutral, has a lot of wealth and money. This is exactly what interested the heroine when she looked at her two knight friends, one of whom was laughing, and the other was. But when the lady suddenly asked the dark-haired guy if she could tell him what only he had told her, he looked at her with surprise with his blue eyes. The protagonist decided to ask Whisperon this because, thanks to the plot, she remembered that after the exchange was suspended, the views of the inhabitants of Media were no longer neutral, but changed to hostile. There is even a rumor that the inhabitants of this country curse everyone around them and wish not only death for everyone. Imagining the leg of an unfortunate slave who was locked in a dungeon and forced to be chained, the girl remembered that among the natives of Media, there are people with a doll-like appearance, who are usually sold for a lot of money. Tilting her head forward and looking at the floor, the lady became wary, realizing that Wisteron and Laios might not know that similar machinations had been carried out repeatedly in the Bricald Empire, and the lady began to worry, since that was where she came from. But now Wisteron didn't suspect anything in front of her, so he extended his hand and told the lady not to be upset, because they still had to get to know themselves better. A blonde man named Laios also spoke to her, telling her that everyone in the temple already knew that Jodel's student had two guards, but two other girls began to look at them, having overheard Laios' words about how Jodel might also have Median blood, since she gets along with animals and even found a common language with the holy beast. And when the knights said that they had no ability to curse people around them, that they said this in order to calm the heroine, However, as soon as the pink-haired lady heard the gossip's words that such terrible people as the unloved Medians could not be personal knights in the Palladium Temple, they passed by them when one of them held a pillar in her hands and openly said that she couldn't imagine how the people of the country of Media could be holy knights. But from the awkward moment, Wister only smiled, scratching his hair because he heard the girl's words perfectly, but chose not to react to them in any way, because these were simple condemnations and gossip. However, the main character categorically disagreed with the gossips, got angry, and shouted to the whole room that the guys were very good and talented, which she considered stunning. This greatly surprised the dark-skinned Wister, who looked at the girl with shock, asking her what she intended to say with her sudden compliments. The lady sold them with a smile, saying that most likely they know a lot about magic too if they grew up on media. And that is why, having imagined in her head a baby and an old man separated by a magic circle of time, the girl remembered that on media people of mixed blood with the most unusual abilities were often born, and usually such unusual people lived much longer. Also imagining how a wedding ring is placed on a woman's hand, the lady remembered that on the continent where her knights, once again imagining the beauty of that country, the girl, thanks to the plot of the novel, remembered that it was in media that the first love stories and novellas began to be created. The lady's descendant remembered Ulysses himself, his magic with flowers, because she understands that Laios and Wisteron can certainly know how to break the almost fateful connection between the Holy King and her. She has already imagined the beauties of that country, namely the city in Media with its canals, sewers, and modern architecture, because she knows that this is where architectural magic first began, as well as the first cameras and as soon as she said loudly that it seemed that in her temple there were no people who would so maliciously humiliate Media and oppress her, the two girls who had previously condemned the knights hurried to leave as soon as possible when they realized that the conversation was about them. Wisteron was very surprised that the girl assured him that even if such people exist, they are complete fools. Even the gossip herself, who had been trying to move away from the company with modest steps, heard how the heroine said about her, too, that it seemed that those people who were taking out their anger on the media were simply constipated.